Hello everyone and welcome to War Sleep Stories. I'm here to guide you into a peaceful, restful state. If you enjoy these stories, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us create more for you. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Take a moment to settle in, get cozy, and let all your worries drift away. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let's begin this journey together. The crisp April night air carried an edge of urgency as Paul Revere stepped into the modest, dimly lit parlor of Dr. Joseph Warren's home in Boston. The year was 1775, and tensions between the American colonies and British Crown were boiling over. Dr. Warren leaned in, his voice low but firm. "The British regulars are on the move," Warren said, pointing to a map spread across the table. "We have reliable intelligence that they plan to march to Lexington and Concord by dawn. They'll seize the munitions stockpiled there and likely arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams." Revere nodded gravely. There was no time to waste. He was tasked with warning the countryside and rallying the militia. His mission would require cunning, courage, and speed, and there was no room for failure. Revere rushed through the cobblestone streets of Boston, avoiding British patrols that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. By the time he reached the home of John Larkin, the well-respected deacon had already prepared his swiftest horse, a steed named Brown Beauty, for the perilous journey ahead. As Revere mounted, the magnitude of his mission weighed heavily. The success of the rebellion and perhaps the future of the colonies depended on his ability to outpace the British soldiers who now patrolled the roads with orders to stop any suspicious activity. The night was eerily quiet as Revere approached the banks of the Charles River. Two trusted patriots waited with a small boat to ferry him across. The men worked swiftly, muffling the oars with cloth to avoid detection by the British warship HMS Somerset, anchored ominously in the harbor. The water was cold, and the tension was palpable. Every sound, the splash of an oar, the creak of wood, felt amplified in the stillness. But Revere's determination never wavered. As they reached the far bank, he disembarked, mounted Brown Beauty, and began his ride. Back in Boston, Robert Newman climbed to the steeple of the Old North Church, a lantern in each hand. One if by land, two if by sea, the plan dictated. Peering into the distance, Newman confirmed the British troops were advancing by water. He placed both lanterns in the church window, sending a silent message across the river. Miles away, patriots stood ready, watching for the signal that would set Revere's warning in motion. Revere galloped into Charlestown, his heart pounding as he delivered the first warnings to trusted allies. "The regulars are coming," he cried, careful not to wake the loyalists who might betray his mission. Each household he visited spread the word further, forming a network of resistance that would grow stronger with each passing hour. By the time Revere left Charlestown, the countryside was already stirring with activity. The road to Lexington was treacherous, dotted with British patrols who had orders to capture any rider carrying news of the advancing troops. Revere relied on his knowledge of the terrain, taking back roads and wooded paths whenever possible. At one point he narrowly avoided capture, his heart racing as he guided Brown Beauty through a dense thicket. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving Revere to catch his breath before pressing on. Revere arrived in Lexington just before midnight, his clothes damp with sweat and river water. He found Hancock and Adams at the home of Reverend Jonas Clark, deep in discussion about the growing unrest. "They're coming for you," Revere warned, his voice steady despite the urgency. Hancock and Adams exchanged a glance, realizing the gravity of the situation. They agreed to leave immediately, while Revere prepared to continue his ride to Concord. As Revere rode on, he encountered other patriots who joined him in spreading the alarm. William Dawes, another rider dispatched by Dr. Warren, met Revere on the road, and together they continued their mission. The countryside buzzed with activity as farmers, tradesmen, and young militia members prepared for the fight ahead. The unity and determination of these ordinary people gave Revere hope, even as the danger escalated. Revere and Dawes made their way toward Concord, but were intercepted by a third rider, Dr. Samuel Prescott, who had just left his fiancée's house. Prescott knew the area well and offered to guide them. Their progress was short-lived. A British patrol appeared suddenly, blocking their path. The riders scattered, each taking a different route to escape. Prescott, familiar with the terrain, managed to reach Concord, while Revere was briefly detained. The British soldiers questioned Revere, but gained little useful information. Determined not to betray his mission, Revere remained calm and evasive. After a tense interrogation, the soldiers released him, choosing to focus on their march instead. Though shaken, Revere refused to abandon his task. He returned to Lexington, where he continued assisting the militia in their preparations for the coming conflict. Dr. Samuel Prescott reached Concord in the early hours, warning local leaders of the British advance. Farmers and shopkeepers were roused from their beds, hastily gathering their weapons and forming militia units. The word spread like wildfire, from one village to the next, ensuring the countryside was ready for the fight. The people of Concord, deeply aware of the stakes, began hiding munitions and supplies in nearby woods and barns. The careful planning of local committees of safety was paying off, as even the most remote farmsteads prepared to resist the British regulars. In Lexington, Paul Revere joined Captain John Parker, the leader of the local militia. Parker, a veteran of previous conflicts, gathered his men on the village green. The militia, a mix of farmers, blacksmiths, and young apprentices, stood in the cool pre-dawn air, clutching their muskets with determination. "Stand firm," Parker instructed. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." His words resonated with the men, who knew they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The morning of April 19th, 1775, arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the fields around Lexington. As the sun rose, the British troops approached, their red coats gleaming. The militia stood their ground, a thin line of resistance against a far larger force. No one knows who fired the first shot. It may have been a nervous militiaman or an overeager British soldier. But once the shot rang out, chaos erupted. The British soldiers unleashed a volley, and the militia scattered, leaving several of their own dead or wounded on the green. Paul Revere watched as the militia regrouped on the outskirts of Lexington, mourning their fallen comrades but determined to continue the fight. Captain Parker ordered his men to retreat toward Concord, where they would join forces with reinforcements from neighboring towns. Revere, though shaken by the violence, remained focused. His warnings had galvanized the region, and the British would soon discover they had underestimated the colonists' resolve. As British troops reached Concord, they found the town eerily quiet. The militia had taken up defensive positions across the North Bridge, while townspeople worked frantically to secure remaining supplies. British soldiers began searching homes and burning what little they could find. The militia watched from a distance, their anger growing as smoke rose from the town. By late morning, reinforcements swelled their ranks, and the tide of resistance began to shift. The turning point came at the North Bridge, where the militia faced off against British troops attempting to secure the Cité. This time it was the colonists who fired first. Their shots were disciplined and deadly, forcing the British to retreat. The victory at the North Bridge marked the first significant colonial triumph of the day. For the militia, it was proof that their cause was not only just but achievable. The British, now realizing they were surrounded, began their retreat toward Boston. The colonists pursued them relentlessly, firing from behind stone walls, trees, and fences. The British column, exhausted and demoralized, suffered heavy losses as they made their way back through hostile territory. Revere joined other patriots in organizing the pursuit, ensuring the British were given no quarter. For hours, the sound of musket fire echoed across the Massachusetts countryside. By the time the British reached Lexington, reinforcements from Boston had arrived to cover their retreat. Even with additional troops, the regulars struggled to maintain order as the colonists pressed their attack. The day's events solidified the resolve of the colonists, who had proven they could stand against one of the most powerful armies in the world. For Revere, the sight of the British retreating was a vindication of all the risks he had taken. In the days following the battles of Lexington and Concord, news of the events spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Riders carried the story to New York, Philadelphia, and beyond, inspiring a wave of resistance. Revere, though exhausted, took solace in knowing that his midnight ride had played a key role in sparking the revolution. His name, along with those of Dawes and Prescott, became synonymous with courage and determination. As the colonies rallied to the cause of independence, Revere reflected on the events of April 18th to 19. He had seen firsthand the power of ordinary people united by a common purpose. Though the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, he believed the spirit of liberty would ultimately prevail. For Revere, the ride was just the beginning. The fight for independence would demand even greater sacrifices, but it was a cause worth every risk. The sun set on Lexington, revealing a somber scene of wounded militiamen and grieving families. Captain Parker and his remaining men worked tirelessly to account for the fallen and regroup for the battles they knew were yet to come. Paul Revere assisted in organizing communications with nearby towns. Messages were sent to leaders throughout Massachusetts, calling for reinforcements and supplies. Though shaken by the bloodshed, the people of Lexington resolved to fight on, inspired by the bravery of their militia. At Concord, the militia regrouped to strategize for the days ahead. Leaders like Major John Buttrick and Colonel James Barrett emphasized the need for discipline and unity. Paul Revere, though not a military commander, offered insight from his experience on the road. The men shared stories of their first encounter with the British, their voices tinged with anger and determination. They knew the events of April 19th would not be the last clash with the Redcoats. Back in Boston, British General Thomas Gage faced the fallout from Lexington and Concord. The regulars had suffered unexpected casualties, and the colonists' resistance had proven more formidable than anticipated. Gage ordered reinforcements from England and tightened his control over Boston, but the city was effectively under siege. Colonists surrounded the city, cutting off supply lines and isolating the British garrison. Paul Revere returned to Boston briefly, slipping past British patrols to consult with Dr. Joseph Warren. Warren had another mission for him, to deliver critical intelligence to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Revere prepared for the journey with his usual thoroughness, knowing the importance of uniting the colonies in the fight for independence. His ride to Philadelphia would prove as perilous as his midnight dash to Concord. Traveling south through Connecticut and New York, Revere encountered a patchwork of colonial resistance. At every stop, he delivered updates about Lexington and Concord, inspiring local militias to prepare for the fight ahead. The roads were treacherous, but Revere's determination never wavered. He reached Philadelphia after days of travel, his arrival greeted with urgency by members of the Continental Congress. In Philadelphia, Revere met with prominent leaders like John Adams, Samuel Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. He recounted the events of April 18 to 19 in vivid detail, emphasizing the need for a unified response. His testimony galvanized the Congress, which began drafting plans for a continental army. The seeds of revolution were taking root, and Revere's role as a messenger and witness became a cornerstone of the effort. While Revere was in Philadelphia, the siege of Boston intensified. Colonial militias built fortifications around the city, cutting off British troops from supplies and reinforcements. Skirmishes erupted along the outskirts, testing the resolve of both sides. The people of Boston endured harsh conditions under British occupation. Food shortages and rising tensions made life in the city increasingly unbearable. Many longed for the day when the colonies would be free from British control. Revere returned to Massachusetts with messages of support from the Continental Congress. The colonies were beginning to unite, and preparations for a larger conflict were underway. Revere shared news of the Congress's plans with Dr. Warren and other leaders, bolstering their confidence. The fight for independence was no longer a regional struggle. It was becoming a coordinated effort spanning the colonies. Revere focused his efforts on strengthening the network of patriots throughout Massachusetts. He worked with groups like the Sons of Liberty to distribute intelligence and coordinate resistance efforts. The colonists' ability to share information quickly and accurately became one of their greatest assets. Revere's experience as a courier made him an invaluable figure in this burgeoning intelligence network. Rumors of British plans to seize colonial munitions spread rapidly, sparking what became known as the powder alarm. Revere was once again called upon to warn towns across Massachusetts, riding through the night to alert militia leaders. The alarm proved to be false, but the response demonstrated the colonists' readiness to mobilize at a moment's notice. The British realized they could no longer rely on surprise to quell the rebellion. As tensions continued to rise, colonial leaders began planning for a major confrontation near Boston. Revere worked with Warren and other leaders to rally support for what would become the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though he would not fight in the battle himself, Revere's role in organizing supplies and spreading information was critical. The militias prepared for the fight with a mix of determination and trepidation. Dr. Joseph Warren, Revere's trusted ally and a key leader of the revolution, took up arms at Bunker Hill. His death in the battle was a devastating blow to the patriot cause, but his sacrifice became a rallying cry for those who continued the fight. Revere mourned the loss deeply, vowing to honor Warren's memory by redoubling his efforts. The battle, though technically a British victory, demonstrated the colonists' ability to inflict heavy casualties on the regulars. The events of 1775 marked only the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Paul Revere continued his work as a courier craftsman, and patriot, playing a vital role in the struggle for independence. The sacrifices of the men and women who fought at Lexington, Concord, and beyond became the foundation of a movement that would change the course of history. For Revere, the midnight ride remained a defining moment, a testament to the power of courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. As 1775 drew to a close, the colonies shifted from scattered militias to a more unified force. The formation of the Continental Army under General George Washington marked a significant turning point. Revere's role evolved from rider to strategist, helping to coordinate supplies and intelligence. Washington's arrival in Massachusetts lifted morale, as his presence inspired confidence in the cause. Revere, working closely with local leaders, ensured that the army had access to weapons, powder, and provisions despite British efforts to cut off resources. The British, frustrated by the ongoing siege of Boston, planned a counteroffensive to break the colonial encirclement. Revere's intelligence network intercepted vital information about troop movements, allowing the Patriots to prepare. The colonists fortified key positions, using their knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver the British. Though skirmishes were frequent, the rebels held their ground, wearing down the enemy through attrition. The winter of 1775 to 1776 was harsh, testing the resilience of both sides. In Boston, British troops struggled with dwindling supplies and rising dissent among the population. Outside the city, colonial forces faced freezing conditions and disease in their makeshift camps. Revere spent the winter coordinating relief efforts, delivering food and clothing to the militia. His ability to rally support from local communities was instrumental in keeping the army intact. In early 1776, the Patriots achieved a breakthrough with the arrival of heavy artillery from Fort Ticonderoga. Henry Knox's daring expedition to transport the cannons over rough terrain was a feat of engineering and determination. Revere worked with Knox to position the cannons on Dorchester Heights, a strategic point overlooking Boston. The British, realizing their vulnerable position, were forced to evacuate the city in March 1776. The British evacuation of Boston was a moment of triumph for the Patriots. As the ships sailed away, cheers erupted from the colonial forces. For Revere, the victory was deeply personal, symbolizing the success of collective effort and unwavering resolve. The city began to rebuild, with Revere taking a leading role in restoring order and preparing for future conflicts. Boston's liberation was a major morale boost for the revolution, but Revere knew the fight was far from over. With Boston secure, Revere turned his attention to expanding the Patriot intelligence network. He traveled throughout New England, establishing new communication lines and recruiting trusted couriers. The network's ability to share information quickly and securely became a vital asset as the war spread to other colonies. Revere's meticulous planning ensured that the Patriots stayed one step ahead of British forces. The British shifted their focus to New York, launching a massive campaign to seize the city. Revere worked with colonial leaders to gather intelligence and rally support, though the scale of the British attack presented unprecedented challenges. Despite the best efforts of the Continental Army, New York fell to the British in 1776. Revere, though frustrated by the loss, continued to provide critical support to Washington's forces, focusing on rebuilding morale and organizing resistance. The signing of the Declaration of Independence in July 1776 marked a defining moment for the colonies. Revere, like many patriots, was deeply moved by the bold assertion of freedom and equality. Though the war's outcome remained uncertain, the Declaration inspired renewed commitment to the cause. Revere used the document as a rallying cry, distributing copies and using its powerful words to galvanize local militias. Revere became increasingly involved in espionage, using his connections to gather intelligence on British plans. His ability to navigate dangerous territory and maintain secrecy made him a valuable asset in the shadow war of spies and informants. The information he provided helped Washington plan key operations, from surprise attacks to strategic withdrawals. Revere's work in the shadows was as crucial as the battles fought on open fields. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge tested the limits of the Continental Army. Revere, though not present at the camp, coordinated efforts to send supplies and maintain communication with isolated units. The Army's perseverance through the hardships of Valley Forge became a testament to their dedication. Revere's behind-the-scenes work ensured that the sacrifices of the soldiers were not in vain. As the war continued, Revere's reputation as a patriot and leader grew. His role extended beyond his midnight ride, encompassing a wide range of contributions to the revolution. Letters and reports praised his bravery and ingenuity, though Revere remained humble, insisting that the cause was greater than any individual. For him, the revolution was about securing a future of liberty for all. The American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 marked a turning point in the war. Revere played a supporting role by ensuring that intelligence and supplies reached the Northern Army in time. The victory convinced France to join the war as an ally, providing crucial support to the Patriot cause. Revere celebrated the news, knowing that the alliance would tip the scales in favor of independence. As the war shifted to the south, Revere adapted his efforts to support the new theater of conflict. He coordinated with leaders in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, ensuring that the Patriot network remained strong despite British advances. The Southern campaign was brutal, with fierce battles and devastating losses on both sides. Revere's unwavering commitment to the cause helped sustain the colony's resilience. The summer of 1778 brought one of the most grueling battles of the war, the Battle of Monmouth. Though Paul Revere was not on the battlefield, his role in delivering vital intelligence and organizing supplies for the Continental Army was indispensable. The intense heat and prolonged fighting tested both sides. General Washington's leadership and the resilience of his troops ultimately forced the British to retreat. The battle solidified the Continental Army as a capable and determined force. Revere turned his attention to protecting New England's vulnerable coastlines. British naval raids threatened towns and trade routes, making maritime security a priority. Revere worked with local militias to build fortifications, arm ships, and establish patrols. His efforts ensured that critical ports like Boston and Newport remained under colonial control, safeguarding supplies and trade routes essential for the war effort. Revere's network of spies and informants played a key role in the Rhode Island campaign. As French forces joined the war, coordination between the Allies and the Continental Army became crucial. Revere facilitated communication between American and French commanders, helping to organize joint operations. Though the campaign ended inconclusively, it strengthened the alliance and demonstrated the growing international scope of the conflict. By 1779, Revere's contributions extended beyond his original role as a courier. His experience and reputation earned him a position as a key advisor to regional leaders. He helped coordinate logistics, train new couriers, and expand the intelligence network. Despite his growing responsibilities, Revere remained grounded in his commitment to the cause. He viewed his work as a duty to future generations, a belief that drove him through even the most challenging times. One of Revere's most controversial moments came during the Penobscot expedition of 1779. As a commander of artillery in the failed naval campaign against British forces in Maine, Revere faced criticism for his actions. Though the expedition ended disastrously for the Patriots, Revere's conduct was ultimately vindicated after a court-martial cleared him of wrongdoing. The experience left him determined to focus on his strengths, organizing and supporting the broader war effort. The war took a toll on Revere's personal life. His wife, Sarah, and their children endured long periods of separation and uncertainty. Letters between Revere and his family reveal the emotional strain of his work, but also their unwavering support for the cause. Despite the hardships, Revere's family played an integral role in his efforts. Sarah managed the household and business in his absence, allowing Revere to dedicate himself fully to the revolution. As the war dragged on, British forces concentrated their efforts in the south. Revere provided critical support to southern militias, ensuring that intelligence and resources reached leaders like Nathanael Greene and Francis Marion. The guerrilla tactics employed by Southern patriots proved highly effective, disrupting British supply lines and weakening their hold on the region. Revere's contributions to the resistance underscored the interconnected nature of the Patriot effort. By 1781, the tide of the war had shifted decisively in favor of the Patriots. The victory at Yorktown, achieved through the combined efforts of American and French forces, marked the beginning of the end for British rule in the colonies. Though Revere did not participate directly in the siege, his years of work behind the scenes had laid the groundwork for success. The network he helped build ensured that the colonies were prepared for the decisive moment. Even after Yorktown, the war was not officially over. Revere continued his work, ensuring that the colonies remained vigilant against British counterattacks. He also played a role in rebuilding the infrastructure and economy of Massachusetts, preparing the region for life after independence. The prospect of peace brought mixed emotions. While Revere celebrated the approaching victory, he knew that the challenges of building a new nation would be immense. The signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially ended the war. News of the treaty spread quickly, sparking celebrations across the colonies. For Revere, the moment was both triumphant and reflective. He thought back to his midnight ride and the countless sacrifices made by his comrades. The revolution had succeeded against overwhelming odds, a testament to the resilience and determination of the American people. With the war over, Revere returned to his work as a silversmith and entrepreneur. He also took on new ventures, including the establishment of a foundry that produced cannons and bells. His business acumen ensured that he remained a prominent figure in Boston's post-war economy. Revere's commitment to civic life continued. He became an advocate for education, public health, and other causes that reflected his belief in the principles of the Revolution. Revere took an active role in commemorating the sacrifices of those who had fought in the Revolution. He worked with local communities to preserve battlefields and honor the memories of fallen comrades. His speeches and writings emphasized the importance of remembering the lessons of the war. For Revere, the Revolution was not just a historical event, but a reminder of the enduring fight for freedom and justice. In his later years, Revere often reflected on the meaning of liberty and the responsibilities it entailed. He believed that the revolution was only the beginning of a larger journey toward equality and democracy. Revere's writings from this period reveal a man deeply committed to the ideals of the revolution even as he acknowledged the challenges of building a fair and just society. Even after the war, Revere remained active in the Massachusetts militia, serving as a brigadier general. He believed that a strong local defense was essential for the stability of the new republic. Revere focused on training and organizing militia units to ensure they were prepared for any future threats. His leadership helped to maintain order during a period of political and social uncertainty. The post-war period brought significant economic hardships, leading to unrest such as Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Revere viewed the rebellion as a symptom of deeper issues within the fledgling government. While he sympathized with the struggles of farmers, Revere supported measures to strengthen the federal government, believing that a unified system was necessary to prevent chaos. His stance highlighted his pragmatic approach to the challenges of nation building. In the 1780s, Revere established a successful foundry that became a cornerstone of his post-war life. The foundry produced a range of goods, including cannons, ship fittings, and bells, contributing to the economic development of the region. Revere's entrepreneurial spirit reflected his belief in self-reliance and the importance of industry in building a prosperous nation. His innovations in metalworking earned him widespread respect as a pioneer in American manufacturing. As Boston recovered from the war, Revere took an active role in shaping the city's future. He served on committees to improve infrastructure, promote public health, and expand educational opportunities. Revere's vision for Boston was rooted in his revolutionary ideals. He believed that a strong and educated citizenry was essential for maintaining the freedoms won during the war. One of Revere's most enduring contributions was his work as a bell maker. The Revere Foundry produced bells for churches, schools, and public buildings, many of which still ring today. Revere viewed his work as a way to unite communities and preserve the spirit of liberty. Each bell was a symbol of resilience and a reminder of the sacrifices made during the Revolution. The ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1787 was a pivotal moment in the nation's history. Revere was a strong supporter of the new framework, believing it provided the stability and unity needed to secure the revolution's gains. Revere attended public debates and advocated for the Constitution in his writings, emphasizing its role in safeguarding individual freedoms while promoting collective governance. The early years of the Republic were marked by political divisions and growing tensions over issues such as slavery and states' rights. Revere, though retired from active politics, remained a vocal advocate for national unity. His letters and speeches called for compromise and dialogue, reflecting his belief in the power of collective action to overcome differences. Revere took great pride in mentoring younger leaders who carried forward the ideals of the Revolution. He believed that the fight for freedom was a continuous process, requiring vigilance and dedication from every generation. Through his writings and public appearances, Revere inspired a new wave of activists and reformers committed to building a more equitable society. Revere often spoke about the contributions of women to the revolutionary cause, including his wife Sarah, who managed the household and supported his efforts. He emphasized the importance of recognizing and honoring the sacrifices made by women who played critical roles in maintaining communities and supporting the war effort. In his later years, Revere reflected on the qualities of effective leadership. He believed that humility, resilience, and a commitment to justice were essential for those in positions of power. Revere's own leadership style, characterized by collaboration and pragmatism, served as a model for others seeking to navigate the challenges of the new republic. One of Revere's last public appearances was at a ceremony commemorating the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Standing before a crowd of patriots, he recounted the events of his midnight ride and the courage of those who answered the call to arms. The event was a poignant reminder of the sacrifices made during the Revolution and a celebration of the enduring spirit of liberty. Revere's midnight ride became one of the most iconic moments of the Revolution, immortalized in poems, paintings, and historical accounts. Though Revere himself downplayed his role, he recognized the symbolic power of the event. The ride became a metaphor for the importance of vigilance and action in the face of tyranny, inspiring generations of Americans to uphold the values of freedom and justice. Revere passed away in 1818, leaving behind a legacy of service, innovation, and patriotism. His life reflected the spirit of the American Revolution and the ideals of liberty and equality that defined the nation's founding. Though he did not seek fame, Revere's contributions were celebrated by his contemporaries and remembered by future generations as a testament to the power of collective action. In the final years of his life, Paul Revere enjoyed the peace and stability that he had fought so hard to help achieve. His days were filled with family gatherings, correspondence with old comrades, and the occasional visit to the foundry, where he proudly watched his sons carry on the business. Though quieter, these years were not without reflection. Revere often spoke of the challenges the young republic faced, urging his children and grandchildren to remain vigilant in preserving the liberties they had won. Revere's business ventures thrived in post-war America, particularly his pioneering work in copper manufacturing. He established the Revere Copper Company, which supplied materials for ships, buildings, and infrastructure projects essential to the young nation's growth. The company's success symbolized the potential of American industry, and Revere saw it as a continuation of his revolutionary ideals, independence through economic self-reliance. The War of 1812 brought renewed threats to American sovereignty. Though Revere was well into his 70s, he offered his expertise to local militias and helped produce supplies for the war effort. His contributions underscored his lifelong commitment to protecting the nation, even in times of personal retirement. Revere viewed the conflict as a reminder of the constant need to defend liberty. Revere became an informal historian of the Revolution, sharing his first-hand experiences with younger generations. He wrote detailed accounts of his midnight ride and other events, ensuring that the true story of the war was preserved. These efforts were critical in countering myths and inaccuracies, providing historians with invaluable insights into the experiences of ordinary patriots. The Boston of Revere's later years was markedly different from the bustling port city of his youth. Urbanization, immigration, and industrialization were reshaping the city, creating new opportunities and challenges. Revere embraced these changes, seeing them as evidence of the nation's progress. He remained active in community affairs, advocating for projects that improved the city's infrastructure and public services. Revere often reminisced about the comrades he had served alongside during the Revolution. He honored the memory of those who had fallen and celebrated the achievements of those who had lived to see the fruits of their labor. Through letters and public speeches, Revere emphasized the importance of unity and mutual respect, qualities he believed were key to the Revolution's success. Revere's grandchildren were a source of immense pride and joy. He relished the opportunity to share stories of the Revolution with them, using his experiences to impart lessons about courage, perseverance, and the value of freedom. These moments of familial connection provided a sense of closure for Revere, as he saw his legacy carried forward by the next generation. One of Revere's proudest achievements was his contribution to the construction of the USS Constitution, known as Old Ironsides. His foundry supplied the copper sheathing that protected the ship's hull, a critical innovation in naval engineering. The Constitution would go on to become one of the most celebrated ships in American history, a testament to Revere's ingenuity and dedication to the nation's defense. Revere witnessed the emergence of a uniquely American culture shaped by the ideals of the Revolution. Literature, art, and music began to reflect the experiences and values of the new nation. Revere took great pride in this cultural flourishing, viewing it as a natural extension of the principles he had fought for. He saw in these developments the promise of a brighter future. As Revere aged, he became increasingly reflective about the legacy of the founding generation. He corresponded with other revolutionaries, sharing memories and discussing the challenges of maintaining the Republic. These exchanges revealed a deep sense of pride in their accomplishments, tempered by an awareness of the ongoing struggles to uphold the ideals of the Revolution. Revere believed that civic engagement was the cornerstone of a healthy democracy. He encouraged his fellow citizens to participate actively in public life, whether through voting, community service, or advocacy. His own life served as a model of civic responsibility, inspiring others to take an active role in shaping their communities. As the years passed, the story of Revere's midnight ride took on a legendary quality. While he appreciated the recognition, Revere often downplayed his role, emphasizing the collective effort that had made the revolution possible. He saw the ride not as a moment of personal glory, but as a symbol of the courage and determination of ordinary Americans. By the end of his life, Revere marveled at the transformation of the United States from a collection of colonies to a thriving republic. He took particular pride in the achievements of the people, whose resilience and ingenuity had made the revolution's promises a reality. Revere's optimism for the future was rooted in his faith in the American spirit, which he believed would continue to overcome any challenge. In his final years, Revere withdrew from public life, focusing on his family and personal interests. Though physically frail, his mind remained sharp, and he continued to offer advice and support to those who sought his counsel. Revere's retirement marked the end of an era, as the last of the revolutionary generation began to fade into history. On May 10, 1818, Paul Revere passed away peacefully in his Boston home at the age of 83. His death marked the end of a life devoted to service, innovation, and the ideals of the American Revolution. Revere's funeral was a modest affair, as he had wished. Friends, family, and fellow patriots gathered to honor his memory, reflecting on the legacy of a man whose contributions had quietly but profoundly shaped the nation's history. Revere's life was a testament to the power of craftsmanship and ingenuity in the service of freedom. As a silversmith, engraver, and industrialist, he used his skills to support the revolution and build a thriving post-war economy. Generations of artisans and entrepreneurs would look to Revere as a model of how individual talent and dedication could contribute to the greater good. His name became synonymous with the American spirit of innovation. Revere's midnight ride was immortalized in the decades after his death, most famously by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in the 1861 poem Paul Revere's Ride. Though the poem took liberties with the historical record, it cemented Revere's place in American folklore. Historians and writers worked to balance the romanticized narrative with the factual details, ensuring that the true story of Revere's role in the Revolution remained accessible and inspiring. The 19th century saw the rise of historical societies dedicated to preserving the memory of the Revolution. Revere's descendants played an active role in these efforts, donating artifacts, letters, and accounts to ensure his legacy was remembered. These organizations helped contextualize Revere's contributions within the broader struggle for independence, highlighting the interconnected efforts of countless patriots. Boston emerged as a focal point of revolutionary history, with landmarks such as Old North Church and the Paul Revere House becoming popular destinations for those seeking to connect with the past. Revere's story was woven into the city's identity, serving as a reminder of the sacrifices and triumphs that had shaped the nation. His life inspired civic pride and a sense of shared heritage among Bostonians. As the United States grew and evolved, Revere's story took on new meanings for each generation. His midnight ride became a symbol of vigilance, courage, and the enduring fight for justice. The story resonated particularly during times of crisis, such as the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, reminding Americans of their shared history and values. Statues, plaques, and other memorials honoring Revere were erected across the country, ensuring his contributions were recognized. One of the most iconic is the equestrian statue of Revere in Boston's North End, unveiled in 1885. These commemorations served as touchstones for public reflection, inspiring future generations to carry forward the ideals of liberty and equality. Contemporary historians have continued to explore Revere's life, uncovering new insights into his work, relationships, and beliefs. Through meticulous research, they have painted a more nuanced portrait of the man behind the legend. Revere's story has become a rich field of study, offering lessons about leadership, resilience, and the complexities of revolutionary change. Revere's descendants carried on his legacy, becoming leaders in business, education, and public service. They honored their ancestors' memory by upholding his values of hard work, integrity, and community engagement. The family's continued success reflected the lasting impact of Revere's principles and his belief in the transformative power of opportunity. The midnight ride became a metaphor for the importance of readiness and action in the face of adversity. Revere's ability to mobilize and inspire others in a moment of crisis offered timeless lessons about leadership and courage. These lessons have been adapted and applied in contexts far beyond the revolution, from military strategy to grassroots activism. Revere's life demonstrated the strength of community in achieving collective goals. From his work with the Sons of Liberty to his leadership in Boston's civic affairs, he exemplified the importance of collaboration and mutual support. His story reminds us that great achievements are rarely the work of individuals alone, but the result of shared effort and solidarity. Paul Revere occupies a unique place in American history, celebrated as both a legendary figure and a real, relatable individual. His life bridges the gap between myth and reality, offering inspiration while grounding us in the complexities of the past. Revere's memory continues to inspire reflection on the values and sacrifices that define the American experience. The events of April 18, 1775, remain a defining moment in American history, embodying the spirit of defiance and determination that led to independence. Revere's role in those events serves as a reminder of the courage required to stand up for what is right. The midnight ride is a call to action for all who value freedom, urging them to stay vigilant and engaged in the defense of justice. As the story concludes, we return to the quiet streets of colonial Boston, where Revere's midnight ride began. The cobblestones echo with the hoofbeats of his horse, a reminder of the urgency and bravery that defined that fateful night. Revere's legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of all who cherish liberty. His story is not just one of a man but of a nation, built on the courage and sacrifices of those who dared to dream of a better future. The sun hung low over the dense forests of the New York frontier, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain that surrounded Fort William Henry. Sergeant Thomas Redding squinted into the tree line, his musket resting against his shoulder. For weeks, rumors of an impending French assault had rippled through the fort's ranks, yet the surrounding wilderness remained eerily still until now. In the distance, faint tendrils of smoke curled skyward, barely visible against the evening sky. Redding's heart quickened as he lowered his musket, his mind racing. Smoke could mean anything. A scouting party, a supply train, or the first sign of an encroaching enemy force. The fort itself was alive with activity as soldiers moved purposefully between the wooden palisades and stone walls. Built to protect British interests along Lake George, Fort William Henry stood as a solitary outpost on the edge of a vast wilderness. To the north lay the French stronghold at Fort Carlson, and beyond that, the powerful French army under the command of Governor Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. Redding's gaze lingered on the horizon, the smoke twisting and dissipating as the evening breeze picked up. He turned to his companion, Private Daniel Harper, who was scanning the same distant plume. "Do you think it's them?" Harper asked, his voice low but tinged with apprehension. He was young, barely 20, and his boyish face betrayed his inexperience, despite months of service on the frontier. Redding didn't answer immediately. Could be," he said finally, his voice measured. "Might just be a campfire, or it could be scouts. Either way, we'll need to report it." He slung his musket over his shoulder and gestured for Harper to follow. Together they descended the wooden watchtower and made their way toward the command post at the center of the fort. As they walked, Redding couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at his gut. He slung his musket over his shoulder and gestured for Harper to follow. Together they descended the wooden watchtower and the center of the fort. As they approached, he looked for signs of the furies that accompanied the fort. Staring at it, the smoke was a harbinger of something. He could feel it in his bones. Whether it was the French or something else, the quiet days of relative safety were coming to an end. Fort William Henry, with its high palisades and commanding view of Lake George, was a symbol of British determination in the wilderness. Yet, to those stationed there, it was more a prison than a fortress. Days were long and monotonous, punctuated only by the occasional skirmish or dispatch. Sergeant Redding paced along the parade ground, observing the organized chaos of daily life. Soldiers in faded red coats drilled with their muskets, while camp followers, wives, children, and traders went about their tasks, hauling water, mending clothes, or attending to the sick in the makeshift infirmary. The sounds of hammering, laughter, and shouted orders blended into the ever-present hum of life in the garrison. The fort had its own rhythm, dictated by the routines of military life. The morning began with the raising of the Union Jack, a solemn ceremony that reminded everyone of their duty to king and country. Redding took pride in ensuring his men upheld discipline. Though he knew morale was tenuous at best, supplies were scarce, and the looming threat of a French attack gnawed at the edges of every conversation. The men laughed and joked during drills, but Redding could see the anxiety in their eyes when they thought no one was watching. In the evenings the fort settled into an uneasy calm. Fires burned low, and soldiers gathered to share stories, smoke pipes, and play cards. Redding often found himself sitting alone, polishing his musket, or writing in his journal. He had learned long ago that silence was his refuge, a way to distance himself from the younger, more hopeful men who still believed in the glory of war. Redding had fought in earlier skirmishes along the frontier, and the things he had seen left little room for romantic notions. War was mud, blood, and despair. Despite the hardships, there was a sense of community within the fort's walls. The soldiers relied on one another not just for survival, but for companionship. The camp followers provided a semblance of normality, their presence a reminder of life beyond the battlefield. His gaze flickered beyond her. Given the hardships, it was about to be shattered. It was about to be shattered. The plume of smoke they'd seen earlier lingered in his mind, a silent warning that the calm would not last. Word of the distant smoke spread quickly through Fort William Henry, stirring a quiet ripple of unease among its inhabitants. By midday, the officers had convened to discuss the possibility of an imminent French advance. Sergeant Redding, though not privy to the high-level discussions, could feel the weight of the moment. Pressing down on the fort, whispers of General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm's name floated through the ranks like the ghost of an enemy already at the gate. Montcalm had earned a fearsome reputation among British troops. Stories of his victories and cunning tactics were enough to unsettle even the most seasoned soldiers. His army, bolstered by disciplined French regulars, Canadian militia, and a formidable contingent of native allies, had proven devastating in the rugged terrain of the frontier. Redding had heard tales of his leadership at Fort Oswego the previous year, where Montcalm's forces had laid waste to the British garrison, leaving no doubt about his capability. Redding's duties that afternoon took him beyond the fort's walls. He and a small detachment scouted the surrounding area, searching for signs of enemy movement. The forest was dense and alive with sound and the voices of twigs. Every noise set Redding's nerves on edge, his eyes darting between the thick trunks and underbrush. "Keep your wits about you," he muttered to his men, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "The French aren't the only danger out here." After hours of fruitless searching, they returned to the fort, where the mood had grown tenser. An urgent message had arrived from Fort Edward, the nearest British stronghold to the south. The courier brought grim news. Montcalm was on the move, leading a large force north toward Lake George. The officers convened again, their faces grim, as they planned for the defense of the fort. Redding listened from the sidelines, catching snatches of conversation, 3 translators and laborers. Montcalm was on the move, leading a large force north toward Lake George. It was clear that Fort William Henry's isolated position made it vulnerable. Reinforcements from Fort Edward would not arrive in time if Montcalm struck quickly. As Redding cleaned his musket that evening, he couldn't help but think of the soldiers who had stood at Fort Oswego. They, too, had believed their walls could hold. Now only their graves remained. The morning dawned heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, the fort shrouded in a pale mist rising from Lake George. Sergeant Redding awoke to the distant roll of drums as the garrison prepared for the day's routines. Despite the ominous news of Montcalm's approach, life at Fort William Henry pressed on. Yet a shift had occurred, small, almost imperceptible. The laughter of soldiers was subdued. The bantering of woe, the disputation, the sweet soft film of sunrise, insensate and calm. Yet a shift had occurred, small, almost imperceptible by the rest of the neighborhood. The mine system, even the camp followers, often the heart of the fort's daily bustle, moved with an air of quiet apprehension. By mid-morning, a messenger arrived from Fort Edward, bearing a sliver of hope. General Webb, commanding the British forces in the region, assured the garrison that reinforcements would be sent if Montcalm's forces advanced. It wasn't the immediate aid they had prayed for, but it was something. Colonel George Monro, the grizzled Scotsman in command of Fort William Henry, addressed the soldiers gathered in the parade ground. His voice, deep and unwavering, carried a sense of determination that resonated through the ranks. "Men," Monro began, pacing before the assembled troops, "the French and their allies may come, but we shall meet them with steel and fire. This fort has stood firm against all odds, and it will stand firm again. Help is on its way, but until then it falls to us to hold this ground, to hold for the King, for our families, and for each other." Redding watched as Monro's words seemed to stiffen the soldiers' spines. It wasn't courage born of confidence, it was the courage of men who had no other choice. As the ranks broke and the soldiers returned to their tasks, Redding found himself momentarily hopeful. Monro's resolve was infectious, and the promise of reinforcements from Fort Edward gave them a reason to keep fighting. Still, Redding couldn't ignore the shadow of doubt that lingered in his mind. That afternoon, Redding took a moment to write a letter home to his wife, Mary. Sitting on an overturned barrel near the barracks, he dipped his quill in ink and tried to find the words. "Dearest Mary," he began, "I pray this letter finds you in good health and spirits. Things here grow tense, and though I cannot share all the details, know that I am safe and think of you every day. If the French do come, we are prepared. My love for you gives me strength. Though I'm safe and think of you every day, if the French do come, we are prepared. My love for you gives me strength. He paused, staring at the unfinished letter. The smoke on the horizon had returned to his thoughts, curling and twisting in his memory like an ill omen. As the sun climbed higher, the soldiers of Fort William Henry set to work strengthening their defenses. Sergeant Redding joined a team tasked with repairing sections of the wooden palisade damaged by the elements. The air was filled with the sound of hammers striking nails, the occasional bark of an officer's orders, and the rhythmic scrape of shovels as earthworks were reinforced. Despite the activity, an air of unease hung over the fort like a shroud of meandulation. The weather's beginning to clear. Humanity is obviously shrouded in darkness. A soul's shade, an air of unease, darkness and deafening cold. The promise of reinforcements offered a glimmer of hope, but the soldiers knew they could not afford to rely on what might come. Redding worked in silence, his hands blistered from gripping tools as he drove thick iron nails into a new section of the wall. Nearby, Private Harper struggled to lift a heavy timber into place, his face flushed from exertion. "You're putting too much of your back into it, Harper," Redding said, stepping in to steady the load. "Use your legs, lad. Don't make work harder than it needs to be." Harper gave a sheepish grin and adjusted his stance. "Aye, Sergeant. Still getting used to building walls instead of breaking them." The men around them chuckled, and for a brief moment the tension eased. Redding allowed himself a rare smile, though it was fleeting. He knew the humor was a thin veneer, barely concealing the anxiety that gnawed at every man present. Later that afternoon, as the men returned to their posts, a commotion arose near the fort's southern gate. A scouting party, dispatched earlier in the day, had returned with alarming news. One of the scouts, his face pale and his uniform streaked with dirt, spoke urgently to Colonel Monroe and the assembled officers. From his post along the battlements, Redding could only catch fragments of their conversation. Large force spotted near the Narrows. Likely French regulars. Movement among the Mohawk trails. Monroe's face darkened as he absorbed the report. He dismissed the scout with a firm nod before turning to his second in command. "Double the sentries. I want patrols every 2 hours. Inform the men to stay alert. No one lets their guard down. Not for a moment." Redding felt a chill crawl down his spine. He looked out over the expanse of trees beyond the fort's walls, his eyes searching for signs of movement. The forest was silent, its shadows deepening as the day drew toward evening. Somewhere out there, the enemy was advancing. How many days or hours remained before they reached the gates? Redding tightened his grip on the musket slung over his shoulder. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it, as he always had, with resolve and the unwavering hope of seeing another dawn. Night fell over Fort William Henry, bringing with it an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional cry of a nocturnal bird or the crackling of watchfires. Sergeant Redding stood on the ramparts, his musket resting against the wooden parapet. The stars above glittered coldly, the light faint against the inky blackness of the forest below. The stillness felt unnatural, as though the wilderness itself held its breath for the nocturnal bird. the night's smooth surface gliding against the inky blackness of the forest below. Reddin scanned the tree line for the 100th time, his eyes straining to pierce the shadows. "Do you see anything?" whispered Private Harper, stationed a few feet away. The young man's voice was barely audible, his nervousness evident. "Not yet," Redding replied, keeping his gaze fixed on the dark expanse before them. "But they're out there. Mark my words." The anticipation was unbearable. Every creak of the fort's timbers, every rustle of leaves carried on the breeze, seemed to signal the enemy's approach. Redding's knuckles whitened as he gripped the musket tighter, his thoughts racing. He had been through enough engagements on the frontier to know that the French and their native allies were masters of stealth. They could be upon the fort's walls before anyone realized they were there. As the hours dragged on, the fort's garrison remained vigilant. Then, shortly before dawn, a cry rang out from the northern watchtower. "Movement in the trees!" The alarm spread like wildfire, rousing the soldiers and camp followers from their restless sleep. Redding rushed to the northern battlements, his heart pounding in his chest. There, in the dim pre-dawn light, he saw them, a line of figures moving through the mist-shrouded forest, their silhouettes barely visible. They were careful, staying just beyond the range of musket fire. But there was no mistaking the sight. French scouts, followed by the bulk of Montcalm's forces, were closing in on the fort. Colonel Monroe arrived on the scene moments later, his face etched with grim determination. "They've shown their hand," he said, addressing the gathered soldiers. "Signal the rest of the men to arms. Prepare the defenses. The time for waiting is over." As the soldiers scrambled to their positions, Redding felt a surge of adrenaline. The enemy was no longer an unseen threat lurking in the distance. They were here, and the siege had begun. The quiet dread of the past weeks was replaced by a sharp, urgent focus. Whatever the coming days held, Fort William Henry would stand, and Redding intended to ensure that, for as long as possible, it did. The morning light brought little relief to the defenders of Fort William Henry. The enemy, now visible through the trees, had halted just beyond musket range. Redding stood atop the northern ramparts, his eyes fixed on the line of French soldiers and their native allies. They were a formidable sight. Ranks of disciplined French regulars in white uniforms, flanked by waves of Canadian militia and native warriors, their faces painted in menacing patterns. Colonel Monroe, stationed near the fort's main gate, shouted orders to the men. "Hold your fire. Let them make the first move. We can serve our powder and shot until they're close enough to feel it." His voice cut through the tension, a steadying force amid the chaos. The enemy did not advance immediately. Instead, they began constructing siege works, hauling logs and earth to create protective barriers. It was a clear signal that this would not be a swift assault, but a calculated siege. As the French worked, Redding's stomach churned. He had seen such tactics before. Slow, deliberate, and relentless. By midday, the first shot rang out. A lone musket cracked from the tree line, its sharp report echoing across the lake. It was followed by another, then another, as the French and their allies tested the fort's defences. The British responded in kind, their muskets barking from the parapets. Reading took careful aim and fired, the recoil jolting through his shoulder. He couldn't tell if his shot had found its mark, but the act steadied his nerves. The exchange escalated as the French artillery opened fire. Cannonballs slammed into the fort's walls, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. The garrison scrambled to reinforce the palisades, hauling sandbags and wooden beams to the most damaged sections. Reading worked alongside his men, his muscles burning as he dragged a heavy timber into place. As the day wore on, the fighting ebbed and flowed. The French would press forward with musket volleys, only to retreat under the cover of their siege works when the British returned fire. The native warriors harassed the fort with hit-and-run attacks, their war cries chilling even the most hardened soldiers. Despite the chaos, the fort held. By nightfall, the French bombardment subsided, leaving the fort in an uneasy quiet. Reading sat on an overturned barrel near the barracks, cleaning his musket by the light of a flickering lantern. The day's events had taken a toll on him, but there was no time for rest. The enemy was out there, regrouping, and he knew the worst was yet to come. "We held today," he muttered to himself, "but how many more days like this can we endure?" Dawn broke with the deep, resonant thud of French artillery firing anew. The first cannonball of the day smashed into the fort's southern wall, sending a shower of splinters and debris into the air. Reading was already on the ramparts, his musket loaded and ready. Around him, the men of the garrison scrambled to their positions, their faces pale but determined. "They're testing us again," muttered Private Harper, who had taken up a position near Reading. He glanced nervously toward the advancing French siege works, which had crept closer during the night. The enemy's cannon emplacements were now well within range, and the fort's defenders could do little but watch, as the attackers methodically prepared for the next phase of the assault. Reading nodded grimly. "They're not in a hurry. They'll pick us apart piece by piece if we let them." His voice was steady, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that had settled over the fort. The French were patient, their movements deliberate. Every moment they waited allowed their numbers to swell, their plans to solidify. Throughout the morning, the defenders returned fire whenever possible. Muskets cracked from the parapets, and the fort's own cannon roared as they targeted the French siege works. The air was thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, and the sounds of battle echoed across the lake. Despite their best efforts, the British knew they were at a disadvantage. Their cannons were few, their ammunition limited, and their numbers dwarfed by Montcalm's growing force. By midday, the French made their first concerted push. Waves of Canadian militia and native warriors surged forward, firing from behind trees and rocks as they sought to overrun the fort's outer defenses. The garrison met them with fierce resistance, pouring musket fire into the advancing ranks. Reading's hands moved automatically as he loaded and fired, each shot accompanied by the sharp report of dozens of muskets around him. "Keep steady," he shouted to his men, his voice rising above the chaos. "Aim true and hold the line." The fighting was fierce, and the attackers were relentless. At one point, a group of native warriors reached the base of the fort's walls, their war cries piercing the din of battle. They readied tomahawks and fired muskets at the defenders before retreating under heavy fire. Redding's heart pounded as he fired again and again, his shoulder aching from the recoil. By late afternoon, the French assault began to wane. Their forces withdrew to their siege works, leaving the ground littered with the fallen. The garrison had held, but the cost was high. Dozens of British soldiers lay wounded or dead, and the fort's walls bore the scars of the day's attack. Redding stood atop the ramparts, his musket resting against the parapet. His uniform was soaked with sweat, his hands blackened with powder. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he gazed out at the enemy camp, where fires burned and shadows moved among the trees. The siege was far from over, and Redding knew that the days ahead would test them all to their limits. The night was far from peaceful. The occasional thud of distant cannon fire reminded the men of their precarious position. Inside the fort's walls, Redding and his comrades barely slept. Some men huddled around campfires, trying to steal a few moments of warmth before the next barrage began. Others, like Redding, paced the battlements, their minds heavy with the weight of the siege. The moon was thin and hazy, offering little light in the darkness. By the time the morning bell rang, Redding felt the strain of sleeplessness and fatigue wearing on him. His hands trembled slightly as he buckled his sword belt and made his way to the ramparts. The stench of gunpowder lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of the damp earth. He found himself constantly scanning the tree line, as if hoping to spot something, anything, that would give them an advantage. But the forest remained eerily still, the silence broken only by the occasional distant shout or the call of a bird. Monroe's orders were clear. Every man would remain vigilant and ready to fight at a moment's notice. But Redding noticed the men were growing weary, both mentally and physically. Even the most seasoned soldiers were showing signs of wear. The constant bombardment had taken its toll. Supplies were running low and morale was beginning to fray. Those who had never been in battle before found themselves grappling with fear, the weight of their uncertainty growing heavier by the hour. Private Harper, who had seemed so eager just days before, now moved with a slow, distracted gait. Redding could see the unease in the young soldier's eyes, the way his gaze darted nervously at every movement. "You all right, Harper?" Redding asked, his voice low. Harper swallowed, glancing quickly toward the horizon. "I don't know, Sergeant. It's all getting to be too much. Every time we think we've held, they just keep coming. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Redding hesitated before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "The fort's walls may crack under their pressure, Harper, but it's not the walls that will break us. It's our hearts. If we let the fear take hold, that's when we lose." He could hear the uncertainty in his own voice, though he did his best to mask it. "Just keep your focus. We'll hold as long as we can." The sound of French cannon fire interrupted their conversation, followed by the familiar crack of musket shots. Another volley had begun. The fort's defenses were being tested yet again, and Redding knew that each round fired would bring them closer to the breaking point. Monroe called for a meeting of his officers just as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern sky. Redding was part of the group that gathered inside the officers' quarters, the air thick with tension. Monroe's face, usually stern and composed, was drawn with exhaustion. "We've already lost too many men," Monroe said, his voice hoarse. "The French will not let up, and with every passing hour, they grow stronger. The reinforcements from Fort Edward will take days to arrive, if they arrive at all. We have to face the fact that we may not make it through this. Redding glanced around the room, his eyes meeting those of his fellow officers. He could see the same uncertainty in their eyes, the same understanding that Monroe's words were more than just a grim forecast. They were a reality they had all quietly feared, but none of them said it aloud. To do so would be to accept defeat. The discussion quickly turned to strategy. Monroe seemed determined to make one last stand, hoping that the enemy would eventually relent, or that reinforcements would arrive in time to save them. But Redding could see the desperation behind the colonel's determination. There was no easy solution, no miracle that would turn the tide. "Let's pray that we hold, gentlemen," Redding said quietly to the officers gathered around him. His words were a fleeting moment of solidarity, a silent promise that they would do their duty, no matter the cost. Outside, the sound of French artillery resumed with renewed fury. Redding turned toward the sound, his chest tight with the weight of the coming days. The siege would only tighten, and the toll would continue to mount. But in that moment, standing with his comrades in the face of the unknown, he knew there would be no turning back. The sun had barely risen when the first explosion rattled the fort's wooden walls. Redding was already on the northern ramparts, his eyes scanning the forest as the echoes of the blast rang in his ears. A cannonball had struck the fort's outer perimeter, sending splinters of wood flying. The fort, once a symbol of British strength in the region, was now showing the scars of a prolonged siege. Redding clenched his jaw, watching as soldiers rushed to reinforce the damaged sections. He had seen forts crumble under siege before, but never with this level of persistence. The French were relentless. Day after day their artillery hammered the fort's walls, and their scouts prowled the perimeter, waiting for a chance to strike. The native warriors, emboldened by their successful skirmishes, had grown bolder, venturing closer to the walls, firing arrows and muskets at any exposed soldier. For Redding and his men, it was a constant state of vigilance, each hour slipping into the next without any real sense of progress. "We can't keep this up," Private Harper muttered, his voice tight with fear as he stood beside Redding. He had the look of a man who had already resigned himself to the inevitable. "They'll break us before the reinforcements arrive. I know it." Redding looked at the young man, his face etched with exhaustion. "I know it's hard, Harper," he said softly, keeping his gaze on the distant enemy lines. "But we hold on. We hold on until we can't any more. That's all we can do." The fort's bell rang, signaling the arrival of another bombardment. The soldiers took their positions, crouching low behind the ramparts. As the cannonballs flew through the air, Redding's mind wandered for a moment, thinking of the life beyond the fort's walls, the world outside this nightmare. He thought of his family, of the quiet life he had left behind, and the distant hope of someday returning to it. But those thoughts were fleeting, overshadowed by the immediacy of the battle around him. The enemy had no interest in what lay beyond these walls. They had one goal, to break the defenders and take the fort. The bombardment continued for hours, the thunderous crashes shaking the fort to its very foundations. When it finally ceased, the silence that followed was deafening. The men, worn and battered, dared not lower their guard. For every moment of peace they knew there was another moment of danger waiting. It was then that the scouts brought back troubling news. The French were preparing for a final, full-scale assault. The siege had reached its peak. Monroe, whose face had grown even more gaunt in the past few days, convened his officers once again. Redding and the others gathered in the war room, the air thick with tension. "They're coming for us," Monroe said, his voice grave. "I have no illusions left. We can't hold much longer." Redding's heart sank as he looked around the room. The officers were quiet, resigned to the reality of their situation. The walls of the fort were weakened from days of bombardment. The ammunition stocks were dangerously low, and their reinforcements were still days away. There was no question now. The fort would soon be overwhelmed. "We need to prepare," Redding said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We'll hold the line as long as we can, but we need to be ready for what comes after." Munro nodded, his expression hardening. "We prepare for the worst then, get the men ready for the final assault. If the French want this fort, they'll have to come through us first." As the officers dispersed to relay the orders, Redding returned to his post. The weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. It was not just the fort they were protecting, but the lives of the men around them. The last few days had been a test of endurance, but now the end was inevitable. He could feel it in his bones. As the day wore on, the sky darkened with the promise of another French attack. The fort's defenders braced themselves, knowing the battle to come would be the bloodiest yet. But there was little time for fear now. Redding tightened his grip on his musket and looked to his comrades. They had stood together for days, and they would stand together until the end, whatever that end might be. The afternoon sun blazed down on the fort as the air grew heavy with anticipation. The men stood at their posts, eyes fixed on the distant forest, waiting for the inevitable. Redding's hands were clammy, his thoughts racing, but he kept his focus on the task ahead. He had been through battles before, but this felt different. The sense of finality, the weight of the siege, was pressing in on him with an intensity he hadn't felt before. "We've held out longer than I thought possible," Harper said quietly beside him. His voice was shaky, but he was doing his best to maintain composure. "But it feels like the walls are closing in, Sergeant." Redding nodded, his gaze never leaving the tree line. "That's because they are, Harper. The enemy's forces are too strong, but we keep holding. We fight for every inch." His words felt hollow, but they were the only comfort he could offer. The fort was already a shadow of what it had been. The fortifications were battered, the men worn to their limits. Suddenly the unmistakable sound of French artillery cut through the air. The cannonballs screamed as they sailed overhead, their sharp whistles followed by the thunderous impacts against the fort's walls. The first few rounds struck near the southern bastion, sending plumes of dust and smoke into the air. The defenders flinched, ducking behind the makeshift barricades and seeking whatever cover they could find. The French weren't holding back anymore. It was an all-out bombardment. The sound of their cannons was relentless, deafening, as the massive projectiles tore into the fort. Redding heard the cry of a soldier nearby as a cannonball struck the parapet, sending jagged wood splinters into the air. The blast rang in his ears, momentarily disorienting him. Get down, he shouted to Harper, grabbing the young soldier by the arm and pulling him behind cover. The world seemed to shake with each new explosion, and the smell of gunpowder stung Redding's nostrils. The fort's defenders responded with what little artillery they had left, but it was clear that the French had them outgunned. The bombardment raged on for what seemed like an eternity. Men scrambled across the ramparts, firing their muskets at whatever targets they could make out through the smoke. The sky was thick with dust and the acrid tang of gunpowder, and the once pristine walls of Fort William Henry were now riddled with holes and splinters. Redding's thoughts flickered to the reinforcements they had so desperately awaited. But it was hard to hold on to hope now. The French were so close. From his position on the northern ramparts, Redding could see the enemy infantry massing at the edge of the forest. Their approach was slow, deliberate, as if they knew the fort's defenses were about to give way. "They're coming, Private Adams," another soldier stationed nearby muttered, his voice trembling. His eyes were wide, and there was a look of dread on his face that Redding had seen in the eyes of many men before a final charge. "They're coming," Redding repeated, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. He gripped his musket tighter. The enemy would not get this fort without a fight, and if this was the end, he would not go quietly. The first wave of French soldiers emerged from the tree line, their bayonets gleaming in the fading light. Behind them, the native warriors prowled, moving like shadows through the underbrush. The French soldiers advanced cautiously, forming tight lines, knowing that the fort's walls could still inflict casualties if they exposed themselves too carelessly. Redding raised his musket, steadying his breath. The time for waiting was over. The battle had begun in earnest. He aimed carefully at the advancing French line, his mind focused on the task at hand. But as he squeezed the trigger, a sudden explosion rocked the fort, sending a shower of debris into the air. Redding staggered, momentarily disoriented, his ears ringing from the blast. "Sergeant!" Harper called, his voice frantic. Redding turned to see the young man stumbling toward him, his face pale. "The gate, it's been breached." The words sent a jolt of fear through Redding's chest. If the gate fell, the fort would be lost. The enemy would flood in, overwhelming the defenders in minutes. He turned quickly, shouting orders to the men stationed at the main gate. "Form up, defend the gate, do not let them in." The soldiers rushed to the gate, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was coming. They had fought for days, but they all knew that once the French broke through the gates, there would be no more retreat, no more hope. This would be their final stand. The battle raged on as the French closed in, their lines pressing ever closer. But within the fort, Redding's thoughts were consumed by one thing: survival. His survival, his comrades, and the knowledge that they had done everything they could. Then, from somewhere in the chaos of the battlefield, the unmistakable sound of a flag being raised rang out. Redding turned sharply. The white flag of surrender. It fluttered in the wind, its meaning clear and crushing. Fort William Henry had fallen. The sight of the white flag, hoisted reluctantly, signaling surrender, was like a dagger through the hearts of every defender within Fort William Henry. It fluttered in the wind, mocking their struggle, their sacrifice. The sound of battle did not immediately cease, but it changed. The French cannons grew quieter, the chaos of musket fire subsiding as the shock of surrender rippled through both sides. Redding stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The flag was not a symbol of victory for his men, it was the end, the final blow. A few moments earlier the walls had been a place of defiance, a bastion of hope. Now they were just a cage trapping them in the inevitable. He looked over at Harper, who stood beside him, his eyes wide, his mouth dry. There were no words between them, none that could make sense of the defeat that was unfolding around them. Private Adams, who had been a soldier full of bravado in the earlier days of the siege, now seemed defeated, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. He glanced from the white flag to the advancing French soldiers, his face a mask of disbelief. "Is this it? Is it over?" he asked, his voice cracking with uncertainty. Redding did not have an answer. He had known deep down that the end was coming. The bombardment had been relentless, their forces depleted. The French had not only outnumbered them, but they had also held the advantage of superior artillery. They had worn the defenders down with slow, methodical precision. But to see the surrender in front of him, after all they had endured, was something he had not fully prepared for. The French forces, under the command of the Marquis de Montcalm, moved cautiously toward the fort, their soldiers keeping their distance, but watching intently. In the distance, the native warriors who had harassed the British throughout the siege now stood in silent formation, their presence a constant reminder of the forces arrayed against them. They had not fought in the traditional sense, but their presence had been enough to ensure that escape had never been an option for the garrison. Redding's heart ached as he watched Montcalm approach the fort's gates, flanked by his officers. The Marquis was a tall, imposing figure, his uniform pristine, despite the hardships of the siege. He had won, and now he had come to claim the prize. But there was no glory in this victory for Redding. It was a hollow triumph, one achieved through attrition, not a brilliant tactical maneuver. "Sergeant," a voice called behind him. It was Lieutenant Weatherby, his face drawn and weary. He looked at Redding with resignation. "It's over. The colonel has agreed to the terms of surrender." Redding turned slowly to face Weatherby, his expression hardened. The terms. His voice was tight, almost bitter. "The French are offering us safe passage," Weatherby said. "They'll let us leave the fort, unharmed. and head back to Fort Edward. But we must lay down our arms, no resistance. Redding's grip on his musket tightened, but he knew there was little choice. They had fought until their last breath, but now they were at the mercy of the enemy. The decision had been made. "I can't believe this," Redding muttered, his words barely audible. "We gave everything, and now we just walk away." Weatherby did not answer immediately. He merely nodded, his face dark with the weight of the decision. "We live to fight another day, Redding. It's all we can do." The men around them were beginning to gather, forming a tight cluster near the gates, where the French soldiers waited, their muskets lowered. It was a strange, surreal scene. After days of constant combat, the tension was suddenly gone, replaced by a haunting calm. Some of the men, dazed by the surrender, stood silently, as though unable to comprehend that the war, for them at least, had come to such an abrupt end. The French soldiers began to file into the fort, their uniforms immaculate despite the days of fighting. Montcalm's officers spoke in low tones with Monro, who appeared defeated, his posture slumped. Monro had tried to keep the fort's defenses intact for as long as possible, but in the end, the reality of their situation had been impossible to deny. Redding felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly swallowed by the overwhelming sense of exhaustion that hung over him. He looked down at his hands, still caked with dirt and dried blood from the battle. His body ached, his muscles sore from days of continuous strain. The fight had been long, and now all that remained was a bitter resignation. "Sergeant," Harper said softly, as if waking from a trance, "do you think they'll let us go?" "Just like that." Redding took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't know," he replied, his voice distant. "But we've no choice now. It's over." The gates were opened wide, and one by one, the British soldiers, Redding among them, were ordered to lay down their weapons. The French soldiers watched as they were disarmed, and for a moment Redding felt the sting of humiliation. He had never thought he would see such a day, the day when the fort, so fiercely held, would fall to the enemy without a single shot fired in response. His pride, once unshakable, now felt like a distant memory. As he and the other soldiers filed out of the gates, Montcalm's voice rang out across the courtyard. "You are free to go," he said in a calm, almost indifferent tone, "but you will not leave unscathed. The fort is ours, and your surrender, while respected, comes at a cost." Redding looked back once more at the crumbling walls of Fort William Henry. It had been a place of hope, of struggle, but now it was a tomb for the dreams of many men. And as he turned his back on the fort, he knew the history of that place would be forever marked by the price of surrender. The soft clinking of iron shackles was the only sound that accompanied Redding and the rest of the surrendering soldiers as they were escorted from the crumbling walls of Fort William Henry. The French soldiers, their faces unreadable, led them in tight, disciplined rows toward the forest beyond. The native warriors, their presence as unsettling as ever, remained at a distance, their eyes following the British soldiers with silent intensity. There was no sign of victory in their gazes, only the quiet satisfaction of a battle won in their own way. Redding's muscles ached, each step a reminder of the toll the siege had taken on his body. His uniform, once crisp and clean, now hung in tatters. His boots were worn, the soles nearly gone from days of marching and combat. He caught a glance of Harper beside him, the young soldier's face pale and strained. Harper hadn't said much since the surrender, but the way he held his head down spoke volumes. The defeat was written in the way they all moved, hunched and resigned, as if even their bodies were too weary to protest the loss. "We should have fought," Harper whispered, barely audible. "We should have fought until the end. At least we'd have died with some honor." Redding, for once, didn't have an answer. It was a sentiment he had heard from others in the camp over the last few days. The question of honor and defeat gnawed at him, but he had seen the reality of their situation too clearly. The French forces, combined with their native allies, had been too much. Their artillery had shattered the fort's defenses, and with the gate breached, there was no more room to fight. The surrender had been a bitter necessity, but it was still surrender. As they walked further into the woods, the trees closing in around them like the walls of a prison, Redding felt a sense of isolation. The battle had taken its toll, not just on the fort, but on the men as well. It wasn't just physical fatigue that drained them now. They had fought valiantly, held out longer than anyone had expected. But now it was over. The only thing left was the long march back to the French camp, and whatever fate awaited them there. It wasn't long before the harsh reality of their situation became clear. The French had taken no mercy on them, and the prisoners were forced to march under tight supervision, their movements restricted by the heavy chains that clinked with every step. Redding's hands, still raw from days of battle, were now shackled, and the cold steel felt like an extension of his own broken spirit. The forest was dense and silent, save for the occasional bird call that broke the stillness. The soldiers were given little in the way of food or rest. Each step felt longer than the last, the weight of their exhaustion growing heavier with each passing mile. Yet the French soldiers kept them moving, the crack of a whip or the shout of a command quick to urge them forward whenever anyone faltered. As the hours stretched on, Redding's thoughts wandered back to the fort. He could still hear the distant sounds of cannon fire, the thundering impacts that had shaken the walls, and the final devastating quiet after the white flag had been raised. He had stood at the northern ramparts, watching as the French advanced, knowing they would be beaten back. No longer. The fort was lost, and with it any chance of reinforcement, any hope of holding out for just a little longer. But as the exhaustion threatened to overtake him, Redding's mind shifted back to his comrades. They were still with him, the few who had survived. In that grim moment, he realized that, despite the defeat, despite the surrender, they had not lost everything. They still had each other. They were still alive. "Do you think they'll treat us well?" Harper's voice cut through Redding's thoughts. He glanced over at the young soldier who had fallen into step beside him. There was a look of confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand what was to come, just as none of them did. Redding shrugged, though he knew the answer. "I don't know. They'll likely keep us as prisoners. Maybe worse if they're feeling vengeful. We're at their mercy now." Harper's face fell, and for a moment there was a heavy silence between them. The march continued, the rhythm of their steps echoing in the air, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. In the back of Redding's mind, a question lingered. What would become of them? They had been soldiers of the British Crown, defenders of the Empire, but now they were nothing more than prisoners. They had no allies here, no friends, only the uncertainty of the future. They reached a small clearing by the edge of the woods, where the French had set up a temporary camp. The soldiers were quickly herded toward the fire, where a handful of officers stood, observing the captives with cold detachment. The French soldiers unshackled their prisoners, but gave no sign of kindness. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the knowledge that this was just the beginning of their new reality. A French officer, his uniform adorned with the gold trimmings of rank, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the prisoners. He spoke in French, his tone sharp and commanding. Redding, although not fluent in the language, could make out the gist of the officer's words. They were to remain here until further orders. No attempt to escape would be tolerated, and they were to wait for transport to a more permanent prison camp. Redding, although not fluent in the language, was assigned to the forces to be immediately marched, officially transported to a new frontier. Redding glanced around at the faces of his comrades, some stoic, others bewildered, but all equally resigned. The harsh reality of captivity had begun to sink in. There would be no more battles, no more glory. The war for Fort William Henry was over. The only thing left was survival. The only thing left was survival. The night fell quickly, the fire casting long shadows over the camp. Redding found himself seated on the damp earth, his back against a tree. The men around him muttered among themselves, some still grappling with the humiliation of surrender, others too exhausted to speak. Harper sat beside him, his face pale, his hands trembling as he tried to light a small piece of dry kindling. "I don't know how we'll get out of this," Harper whispered, more to himself than to Redding. Redding didn't have an answer. He could only offer the silence of shared misery. They had been defeated, but they had not been broken. Not yet. They were still alive. And as long as they were, there was still hope, however faint it might seem. The following morning came far too quickly. Redding's eyes fluttered open to the sound of French officers shouting orders. The camp was already stirring, the French soldiers moving with the practiced efficiency of an army that had been on the march for months. Redding had not slept much, his body aching from the strain of the previous days, his mind restless with a gnawing fear of what awaited them. The fire from the night before had died down to embers, leaving behind a faint smell of smoke in the cold morning air. "Move!" barked one of the French soldiers, urging them to rise. He gestured roughly toward the line of trees, where the road lay beyond. "You are to march." Redding could barely muster the strength to stand, his legs stiff from the cold and the exhaustion. He helped Harper to his feet, the young soldier's body trembling slightly from the chill. Their shackles were replaced with new restraints, heavier this time, making every step a struggle. The French soldiers kept a close watch on them, their eyes wary as though expecting some sign of rebellion. But none of the prisoners made a move. What was the point? Their options were few, and any attempt to flee would likely mean death. The French officer from the night before had ordered that they be marched to a prison camp located to the south, a journey that could take days depending on the conditions. Redding wasn't sure what awaited them there. He had heard rumors of overcrowded, filthy camps where prisoners were treated worse than animals. But no one knew for certain. All he knew was that the French would treat them with disdain, if not outright cruelty. He stole a glance at the men around him, haggard, hungry, broken in spirit. and saw the same fear reflected in their eyes. They set off, trudging through the forest in silence. The air was thick with fog, the trees standing like sentinels as the small group of prisoners marched under guard. The French soldiers flanked them on either side, their muskets ready. Every few paces, Redding could hear the jingle of the chains as they clinked with each step. He glanced back at the fort one last time, the silhouette of the fort's remnants barely visible in the distance, but the loss was already too deep to grasp fully. The road ahead was no easier than the road behind. The journey took them through dense woods, over uneven terrain, and across marshy fields. The prisoners were given little food, and the French did not make allowances for their injuries or fatigue. Redding's stomach growled, empty and hollow, and he could feel his energy slipping away with each passing hour. They were given small rations, hard biscuits and thin, salty meat, but it was barely enough to keep them moving. No one dared to complain, not in the face of their captors' cold indifference. The march stretched on for hours. Redding focused on putting one foot in front of the other, trying to block out the discomfort and the gnawing hunger. He kept his eyes on the back of the soldier in front of him, keeping a steady rhythm, letting his mind wander to the past, the days before the siege, before the surrender. It felt like another lifetime. The camaraderie of the men at Fort William Henry, the hope that had been present in their eyes despite the overwhelming odds, it was all gone now. Now they were nothing more than prisoners of war, bound by chains and awaiting whatever fate the French decided for them. By mid-afternoon they reached a small village, where the soldiers stopped to rest for a few moments. The French officers conferred in low voices, while the soldiers kept their eyes on the prisoners, their rifles never straying too far from their hands. Redding, exhausted and sore, sank down onto the ground, resting against a nearby tree. Harper joined him, his face pale from the ordeal. "How much farther do you think it is?" Harper asked, his voice quiet, strained. Redding didn't have an answer. "I don't know," he replied, though he suspected the worst. The French had kept them moving at a brisk pace, and their exhaustion was evident. Still, he knew they were nearing a decision point, whether they would be taken to a prison camp soon, or whether they would face further humiliation and suffering. The rest of the prisoners sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their expressions reflecting the weight of their circumstances. Some of them had once been brave men, officers and soldiers with dreams of victory, of glory in battle. Now they were little more than shadows of their former selves, marching under the harsh commands of their captors. The pride of the British Army had been broken at Fort William Henry, and now these men were left to face the consequences of their surrender. As they resumed the march, Redding caught sight of something that stirred a deep unease in his chest. In the distance, along the road ahead, he could see a column of smoke rising from the tree line. The smell of burning wood and the faint crackle of flames reached his ears, making him tense. Had the French set fire to a nearby settlement? Or was this something more ominous? The soldiers too noticed the smoke, and the French officers increased their pace, urging the prisoners forward with harsh commands. The ominous presence of the smoke only intensified Redding's growing sense of dread. Something was happening, but he couldn't quite place what it was. Was this a new kind of punishment, or was it a sign of something worse to come? As they moved closer to the source of the smoke, Redding saw that it wasn't a settlement burning, but a large makeshift camp. The prisoners were marched toward it with no explanation, the tension in the air thick and palpable. As they entered the camp, the French soldiers tightened their formation, their eyes scanning the surrounding area as if expecting an attack. This wasn't a typical prison camp, Redding realized. The atmosphere was different. The soldiers had set up defenses, palisades, and watchtowers, and the camp was crowded, far more than he had anticipated. This was no place of relative safety for captives. It was a holding pen, a place to house those deemed expendable. A French officer approached them, his expression hard. "You will stay here," he ordered in broken English. "No movement, no escape." Redding glanced at the men around him, their faces drawn, their eyes filled with a mix of confusion and fear. They were not just prisoners. They were being herded like cattle, taken to a place where survival would be the greatest battle they would face yet. As they were shoved into the camp, the reality of their situation sank in. The journey had not brought them any closer to peace. In fact, it felt as if they were now at the mercy of an entirely different kind of war. One waged not with muskets and cannons, but with hunger, sickness, and despair. Redding knew then that this was no ordinary prison. This was a place of suffering, a place where men were discarded, left to waste away in the shadow of defeat, and he had no choice but to endure. The days blurred together in the prison camp. The mornings came too quickly, the cold biting into their bones before the sun had fully risen. The nights were longer, the fires struggling to provide warmth as the winds howled through the makeshift shelters. The camp, a sprawling collection of ragged tents and crude huts, was overcrowded and filthy. The air smelled of sweat, wet earth, and the stench of unwashed bodies. The French soldiers who guarded the prisoners were a constant presence, their eyes sharp, always alert for any sign of rebellion or escape. Redding sat on the ground, his back pressed against the rough wood of the shelter. His hands were stiff from the cold, his fingers aching as he clutched a small piece of stale bread, the only sustenance they had been given that day. The bread was dry, almost impossible to swallow, but it was all they had. He glanced around at the other men, each one hunched over in exhaustion, their faces hollowed by hunger and deprivation. Harper sat beside him, his face gaunt, eyes red from lack of sleep. "How much longer do you think we'll be here?" Harper asked quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Redding shook his head. He didn't have an answer. The French officers had made no effort to explain their plans for the prisoners. There had been no word of a release, no promise of better conditions. Every day felt like a slow descent into despair, the promise of survival fading with each passing hour. Yet still, they clung to life, for what else was there to do? "We have to keep going," Redding said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Survive. That's all we can do." Harper didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said it all. They were both struggling to hold on to any hope, but the conditions were growing worse by the day. Sickness had begun to spread through the camp. A few men had already died, their bodies unceremoniously dumped into a pit outside the camp's perimeter. The cold seemed to freeze everything: time, hope, even the will to fight. It had been a week since they'd arrived at the prison camp, and the days had become a blur of misery and exhaustion. The French soldiers treated them with little more than contempt, their guards making it clear that the prisoners were nothing more than a nuisance to be managed. There was no empathy in their eyes, no compassion in their commands. They watched the men closely, ready to lash out at any sign of defiance, their rifles always within arm's reach. Redding had grown used to the cold, though it still gnawed at his bones. He had learned to sleep in short bursts, his body never truly at rest, always alert to the sounds of the camp, the crack of a French soldier's boots on the frozen ground, the murmurs of the prisoners, the occasional shout that would echo across the camp when a prisoner broke a rule or stepped out of line. He had come to understand that survival in the camp meant submission. Those who resisted, who tried to defy the guards, were punished, often harshly. The French had little tolerance for defiance, and even less for weakness. Harper, despite his earlier bravado, had begun to fade. His once youthful energy was now consumed by an eerie, hollow weariness. Redding noticed it first in the way he carried himself. The small spark that had once flickered in his eyes was now gone, replaced by a dull, lifeless gaze. He was slowly succumbing to the hardships of captivity, just as so many had before him. Redding had seen it in others, the slow erosion of spirit that came with the crushing weight of captivity. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the men huddled around a meager fire, Harper spoke again, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I don't know how much longer I can take this, Redding. The cold, the hunger, it's too much." Redding looked at him, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was happening. Harper wasn't the only one slipping. There were others in the camp who had begun to show signs of despair. The men were fading, one by one, their resolve crumbling in the face of starvation, disease, and the brutal conditions. Redding had seen it in their faces, the hopelessness that had begun to settle in, the resignation that death was inevitable. "You can't give up," Redding said quietly, though the words felt more like a plea than a command. "We have to keep going, if not for us, then for those who didn't make it this far." Harper gave a weak nod, but it was clear that his resolve was fraying. The thought of death seemed too close, too real to ignore. Redding, though, held on to the belief that survival was still possible. He had to believe that, for without it, there was nothing left. The next morning, Redding awoke to the sound of footsteps outside their shelter. He sat up quickly, the familiar dull ache in his muscles greeting him. The French soldiers had come to distribute the meager rations of food, but Redding's stomach turned at the thought of eating more stale bread. Hunger had long since become a constant companion, gnawing at him like an animal inside his gut, but was the cold that was the real enemy now. Harper had fallen asleep next to him, his breath shallow, his body unnaturally still. Redding leaned over to check on him, and his heart sank. Harper's face was pale, his lips cracked from dehydration, and his skin clammy. The young soldier's chest rose and fell weakly, but there was no mistaking the signs. Harper was ill. Redding swallowed hard, his throat tight with fear. Illness in the camp spread like wildfire. There were no medicines, no care beyond the occasional offering of water or bread. Those who fell ill were often left to suffer in silence, their bodies deteriorating until they were either too weak to continue or died quietly in the night. Redding stood, feeling the tremble in his legs as he did so. He looked around the camp, taking in the scene, the other prisoners, their faces gaunt, their bodies slumped in defeat. Some of them, like Harper, had already begun to fade. Redding's heart ached for them, but he knew that there was little he could do. He had no way to stop the sickness, no way to protect them from the disease that was spreading. The French soldiers arrived, distributing the daily rations. Redding took his portion of bread, though he had no appetite for it. His mind was focused entirely on Harper. He returned to the shelter, kneeling beside the young soldier and placing a hand on his forehead. "Harper, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low. Harper stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open. He blinked a few times, disoriented, before his eyes found Redding's. "I'm here," Redding said, trying to keep his voice steady. You need to eat something. Just a little, it'll help." But Harper only shook his head weakly. "I can't. It's too much," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I'm not going to make it, Redding." Redding's heart tightened. He knew the words were true. Harper's body was giving up, and there was nothing Redding could do to stop it. In the midst of the cold, the hunger, and the sickness, they were all losing something. But seeing Harper, young and full of potential, begin to fade like this, it hurt more than anything he had felt since the battle at Fort William Henry. "You don't know that," Redding whispered, though he knew deep down it wasn't just the illness that was taking him. It was the weight of everything else, everything they had been through, and the brutal truth that there was no way out of this hell. And so Redding sat with Harper, knowing that this was the true war they were fighting, the one not for territory or glory, but for survival, for any hope of seeing another day, no matter how slim that hope was. We must enter this war. Did it signify it? I'm dreading dimly finding this battle. The days grew colder as winter tightened its grip on the camp. The early mornings were marked by frost on the ground, and by noon the air still held the bite of a relentless chill. The men huddled together for warmth, their bones stiff with the cold, their movements slow and labored. The guards remained vigilant, though their attention seemed scattered, their eyes growing weary as the days dragged on. They were accustomed to their control over the prisoners, but it was clear that even the French soldiers were wearied by the endless winter and the daily monotony of their task. Redding's thoughts were clouded with worry for Harper. The young man had become little more than a shell of the person he had once been. His once bright eyes now seemed dull, and his body was weak, too frail to support him as it had in the past. Either his fevered sickness or his mental slowness was killing him, and there was nothing Redding could do to help him. He had heard rumors of men being taken away to a makeshift infirmary, but the place was a cruel joke. Men piled on top of each other, left to suffer in their own filth until they succumbed to the ravages of disease. It was hardly a place of healing. One morning, as Redding returned to the shelter after a futile attempt to gather wood for a fire, he found Harper lying still on the ground. The young soldier's face was flushed, and his breathing was shallow, a faint wheeze rising with each desperate intake of air. Redding rushed to his side, but he could see it had once been there was gone, littering up to the shelter after a futile attempt to gather wood for, after sleeping in the ground with the great Harper, Redding murmured, his voice thick with emotion. You need to stay with me just a little longer, all right? Please. But Harper didn't respond. His body trembled, shivering violently, even under the pile of tattered blankets that Redding had gathered for him. There was nothing more Redding could do. No water, no medicine, no warmth could stave off the inevitable. Harper's eyes fluttered closed again, and Redding felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He gently placed a hand on his friend's forehead, feeling the heat that radiated from it. A fever that would likely claim his life before the day was out. Harper's eyes fluttered closed, again and again. A fever that would likely claim his life before the day was out. The camp was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of men murmuring and guards shouting commands absent for the moment. Redding knew they were all too familiar with the toll the cold and hunger had taken on their comrades, and though it broke his heart to see Harper like this, he wasn't surprised. Death was a constant presence in the camp, lurking just behind every shelter, every pile of straw, and every empty stomach. It was an enemy they could never truly fight off, only endure. Hopes for terrors to come are not truly diminished. He gently adjusted Harper's position, trying to make him more comfortable. As he did, the faintest of smiles crossed Harper's lips, a brief flicker of recognition before the young man's eyes closed for the last time. Redding felt his throat constrict. The boy was gone, just like so many others before him, and undoubtedly so many more would follow. Redding closed his eyes for a moment, a pang of guilt washing over him. He had promised himself that he wouldn't leave Harper behind, that he would get him through this. But he had failed, and this unforgiving place, there was no place for promises, no place for hope, only survival. But he had failed. In this unforgiving place, there was no point of remaining possessed of his memories. He'd spent 2 weeks only. The French soldiers had been busy tending to their own needs, the prisoners suffering nothing more than an afterthought in their minds. It wasn't until later in the afternoon, when one of the soldiers approached the shelter to check on the prisoners, that Harper's body was noticed. The French officer gave a brief glance at the lifeless form, and with a simple gesture, a pair of soldiers moved Harper's body without ceremony. They dragged him away from the shelter, tossing his remains into a pile of others who had perished in the cold. Redding watched the scene in silence, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. There was no dignity in death here, no mourning, no honor for the men who had fought, lived and died. They were reduced to bodies, swept aside, as if they were nothing more than refuse. The French soldiers went about their task without so much as a glance at the faces of the dead. It was all too familiar now, the indifferent cruelty of captivity. Redding stood there for a moment longer, his eyes lingering on the spot where Harper had been, the young man's face still fresh in his mind. The cold seeped into his bones, and he turned away, back to the fire where the other prisoners sat, their eyes dull with the same resignation that now filled him. He didn't know how long he would last in this place, how much longer he could endure the endless suffering, the slow erosion of his own spirit. He didn't know how long he would last in this place, how much longer he could endure the endless silence, clear from sight. But in that moment something inside him hardened. Harper had been taken from him, but Redding would not let his memory fade into the same indifference that had claimed so many others. The camp's guards continued their rounds, indifferent to the lives they controlled. Redding stood by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. His thoughts drifted back to Fort William Henry, to the days before the siege, when he had been a soldier in a regiment of men who had believed in something greater than themselves. Back then, they had fought with pride, with the belief that the world they lived in was the best place and greatest benefit. Fort William Henry, to whom the names Garrick, Callale, Pencroft, Laguardia, and Tenrod, back in the days when he was honest to the lions and guided them by the memories of their calling. Now they were nothing more than cattle, waiting for the inevitable slaughter. But Redding's resolve was not broken, not yet. Despite the crushing weight of defeat, despite the horrors of the prison camp, he could still feel a spark inside him, a desire to survive, to live, and to remember those like Harper who had perished. He knew that the battle wasn't over yet. There was still a fight to be had, even if it wasn't the one he had originally signed up for. As the cold night settled over the camp, Redding sat by the fire, his hands wrapped around the warmth of the small flames. His thoughts turned inward, seeking the fragments of his former self, the man who had stood tall, confident, and proud in the face of the enemy. Beside the unseeing, he couldn't let that man die here, in this place of suffering. He couldn't let that man die in this place of suffering. He couldn't let that man die in this place of suffering. He couldn't let that man die in this place of suffering. Tomorrow he would wake again. Tomorrow he would find the strength to face another day. But for now, he allowed himself to grieve, to remember the brotherhood they had shared, the men who had fallen before him, and the one who had just left this world. And he whispered a quiet prayer into the wind, asking for strength, for survival, and for the courage to endure. The week stretched on in agonizing silence, and Redding felt the weight of each passing day. The bitter cold seemed to seep into every part of his being, making his bones ache and his muscles stiffen. Though the fire burned weakly in the center of their shelter, it offered little more than a flicker of warmth against the encroaching chill. The frost on the ground grew deeper, and the air, sharp with ice, stung his lungs with each breath. The sounds of the camp, the shuffle of tired feet, the low murmurs of the men, the occasional bark of a French soldier, became a constant hum in his mind, impossible to escape. Redding had learned to move slowly, to conserve his energy, and above all, to resist the creeping sense of despair that gnawed at him. It was a battle fought inside the mind, a struggle to keep hope alive when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. The cold, the hunger, the death, each element wore at his spirit, dragging him towards surrender. But he fought it, for Harper, for the men who had fallen, for himself. He had taken to keeping watch over the other prisoners, looking out for signs of illness, exhaustion, or injury. There was nothing else to do but wait, to endure, and to make sure that no one else suffered as Harper had. The camp was a slow death, one that claimed each prisoner piece by piece, first the body, then the mind, until nothing was left but an empty shell. Redding had seen it in the eyes of the men around him, the glazed look of defeat, the hollow stares that spoke of lives slowly being extinguished. One of the soldiers, a man named Flint, had fallen ill 2 days ago. Redding had noticed the signs immediately: trembling hands, fevered eyes, and a cough that racked his chest. Flint had tried to keep moving, tried to pretend that he was fine, but the disease was taking hold. Redding had done what he could, offered him water, a portion of his meager ration, but he knew it wasn't enough. Flint had not been the first to fall ill, and he wouldn't be the last. Now, Flint lay next to Redding's shelter, propped up against a wooden beam, his face pale and drawn. His breathing was laboured, shallow, and his eyes fluttered open only briefly. Redding sat beside him, his hand resting lightly on Flint's shoulder. There was nothing to say. Words had no meaning here. No one spoke of death. It came quietly, without fanfare, without ceremony. It was simply a part of life in the camp. Without Redding had become numb to it. The pain of loss, the grief that once surged through his veins, had dulled with time. It was as if he had reached a point of exhaustion, where his emotions had retreated into some distant corner of his mind. He could still feel the weight of it, the crushing heaviness, but it was as though his body had learned to live with it, to bear it without breaking. "You'll be all right," Redding whispered to Flint, though he didn't believe it. It was the same empty phrase he had offered to countless men before, words that were meant to comfort, but which had no meaning here. Flint's response was a barely audible grunt, a weak movement of his hand that seemed to indicate a flicker of awareness. Later that evening, as the cold began to settle in once more, Redding felt a familiar weight in his chest, a tightness, a heaviness that seemed to come with the silence of the camp. Flint had passed quietly in the night, his body still and cold by morning. Another soul claimed by the unforgiving camp, another name to add to the list of those who had fallen. Redding didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet gravity. He had no more tears to shed for the men who died. There was nothing left but survival. The French soldiers had grown even more indifferent as the days passed. Their presence had become a routine part of the men's lives, their faces impassive as they made their rounds. Occasionally, one of the officers would bark an order, or a soldier would shout something in French, but the meaning was always the same: control. The prisoners were to stay where they were, to endure, to wait for whatever fate had in store. In the middle of this daily cycle, an unexpected visitor arrived. A French officer, tall and imposing, appeared at the edge of the camp, accompanied by a small entourage of men. He wore the dark blue coat of a higher-ranking officer, his gold epaulets gleaming even in the weak sunlight. His presence caused a ripple of movement through the camp as the prisoners stared at the mixture of high and low level of Assessor Emilian power. His warped cloak of a high-ranking officer, his gold epaulets gleaming even in the weak sunlight. His presence caused a ripple of pleasure through the citadel. Redding watched from the distance, his heart racing. The officer's eyes scanned the camp, taking in the miserable conditions, the sick men, the listless prisoners. He did not speak immediately, but his gaze lingered on the men, as though measuring them, measuring their worth. The silence stretched long before he turned to one of his subordinates and gave a brief command. At that moment, a group of prisoners were gathered and led toward him. Redding stiffened. He recognized one of them, Branford, a fellow soldier from his regiment. Branford had been a good man, tough and resilient, always able to make light of the situation. But now, as he was marched forward by the soldiers, his face was drawn, his eyes filled with the same hollow resignation that Redding had seen in so many others. Branford's shoulders were slumped, and his posture suggested that he had already given up the fight. The officer's words were lost in the wind, but Redding could see the interaction clearly. The officer was speaking to Branford in rapid French, his voice cold, commanding. Branford responded, his words quiet and cautious. Then, after a moment, the officer turned away, signaling for the soldiers to march the prisoners back to their shelter. Redding's stomach tightened. He had no idea what had just transpired, but it was clear that the French officer had come with a purpose. The atmosphere in the camp shifted, even if only slightly, as the prisoners began to murmur among themselves. There were rumors of a change in command, a shift in strategy, but no one knew what it meant, that the French would finally decide their fates. It was too early to tell, and Redding knew better than to get his hopes up. Any hope, no matter how small, was dangerous. It could lead to disappointment, to more despair. The days in the camp had taught him that hope was fleeting, as fickle as the wind. The only thing he could rely on was the cold, the hunger, and the endless march of time. And yet, despite everything, something stirred deep inside him. The French officer's visit, the men gathered in front of him. It all seemed like a signal, something that might break the monotony of their suffering. The wait for answers, for any sign of change, became more pressing, more insistent. Would they remain in the camp until they withered away, or was something more at play? The wait for answers, something more at play. As the officer and his men disappeared from view, Redding stood quietly by the fire, his thoughts swirling. Perhaps it was wishful thinking, but he couldn't help but wonder if the future was about to change. The waiting had been endless, but maybe, just maybe, it was finally nearing its end. The morning after the French officer's visit was one of those rare moments when the usual gloom of the camp seemed to lift, if only slightly. The men spoke in hushed voices, sharing rumors and speculation, trying to make sense of what had happened the day before. The officer's sudden appearance had shaken something loose among the prisoners, a spark of curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of hope. The camp, so long trapped in the rhythms of cold, hunger, and silence, felt different. There was a sense of anticipation, a buzz in the air that Redding had not felt in weeks. Though the officer had left with no clear explanation, His presence had stirred something within the prisoners. Some of the men muttered that the French might be preparing to move them, to either release them or transport them elsewhere. Others whispered about a possible exchange, the kind of negotiation that might bring them back into the fold of the army, or, at the very least, offer a reprieve from the suffering they had been enduring. It was, as always, unclear whether any of these rumors were founded in reality, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the men had something to hold on to, something to discuss, something to fuel their restless mind. Redding found himself caught in the tide of speculation, though part of him resisted the temptation to believe in any of it. The camp had proven time and again that any hope could be dashed just as quickly as it arose, and yet, even as he tried to keep his own expectations in check, he found it hard to ignore the faint stirrings of optimism in his chest. It was as if the very act of being seen by the officer, of being acknowledged, had breathed a new kind of life into them all. But he couldn't let himself fully embrace the idea of change. Redding had seen enough to know that anything, any hope, was fragile. He had seen too many men who had died clutching at the smallest of promises, only to have them fade into nothing. It was better to hold on to the reality of survival, to the grim certainty of each passing day. And yet, even as he told himself this, a part of his mind was shifting away from the camp. As the days wore on, the camp remained in a strange state of suspended animation. The French soldiers continued their patrols, their routine seemingly unaffected by the visit of their officer, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The prisoners were more alert, more watchful. They spent less time hiding in their shelters, more time gathered in groups, sharing stories and planning as if they, too, had caught a glimpse of something different on the horizon. The men began to speak more freely, no longer haunted by the fear of punishment for idle conversation. They even laughed, a quiet, uncertain kind of laughter, but it was a sign of something returning to them that had been long absent, their humanity. They were still men, still soldiers, and they hadn't forgotten how to survive. But survival was no longer the only thing that drove them. They began to talk of what they might do if they were freed, what they might return to, what they might find in the world beyond this prison. Redding found himself drawn into these conversations more often, though he remained cautious in his optimism. He knew that none of them had any real information, no way of knowing what the French officer's visit truly meant, but it was enough to keep the men occupied, to give them something to look forward to, however faint it might be. The alternative, after all, was to sit in silence, to let the hopelessness of their situation crush them from within. On the 5th day, after the officer's visit, the camp experienced its first sign of real change. People were immediately on alert, his muscles tensing as he glanced around for the source of the sound. The French soldiers were moving in formation, but this time there was something different about the source of the sound. They weren't moving in the usual patrol pattern. Instead, they were gathering in groups near the perimeter of the camp, as if preparing for something. Redding watched closely, his heart beginning to race. The men around him fell silent, eyes darting nervously from one soldier to the next. The atmosphere shifted again, this time from speculation to outright uncertainty. What were they preparing for? Was this the beginning of their transfer? A new round of punishment? Or something else entirely? Redding watched closely, his heart beating to find out the sensation tracing down his spine. A new round of punishment, as celestial transfiguration hinted to departure. The sound of the boots drew closer, the rhythmic thumping growing louder until it seemed to reverberate in Redding's chest. Finally, a French officer appeared at the entrance of their shelter, his face stern, his posture rigid. He carried a clipboard, and his eyes scanned the prisoners with a level of intensity that made the men shift uncomfortable. "Prisoners," the officer called out in a harsh, clipped voice. "Move to the assembly area, now." The words were simple, but their meaning was immediate and clear. Redding's heart skipped a beat as the prisoners around him began to stir, rising from their spots by the fire, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The officer didn't wait for any protest. He simply gestured for the men to begin moving. Redding followed the crowd, his mind racing. What was going on? Why were they being called to assemble? His steps were slow, careful, his eyes scanning the faces of the men around him. Some were anxious, some confused, others resigned. The French soldiers watched them closely as they marched toward the assembly area, a small cleared space near the center of the camp. The prisoners had little choice but to comply, their movements sluggish but determined. Redding took his place among the others. He could see that the entire camp had gathered. The other prisoners, sick, weak, starving, stood in line, some leaning on their comrades for support. There were no cries of joy, no cheers, only an uneasy silence that hung heavily in their hands. The French soldiers stood at attention, their rifles held firmly in their hands, their eyes alert, staring. It was not a moment to be missed. Then, as Redding stood there, trying to decipher the meaning of this sudden gathering, he saw it. The French officer from earlier, the one who had visited the camp, stepped forward once more, his presence commanding. He addressed the gathered prisoners in a low, measured tone, though Redding could only catch a few words from the tense body language of the men around him. He understood that the officer was speaking of something significant, something that would change the course of their days in the camp. "Vous êtes libre," the officer said, his voice cold but clear. "You are free." For a moment, the words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to grasp. The men around Redding seemed frozen, staring at the officer with disbelief, as though they hadn't heard correctly. Then, slowly, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Redding stood there, motionless, his mind struggling to catch up to the words he had just heard. Free. Free. Was it possible? Could it be true? His heart began to race again, faster now, and his legs shook slightly beneath him. He wasn't sure if it was the shock or the sudden surge of emotion that made him dizzy. The cold, the hunger, the endless wait, they had all led to this moment. And yet, even as he tried to process it, part of him refused to believe it. It was too sudden, too unexpected. Free. The officer's next words broke the silence, and this time Redding heard them clearly. Gather your things. You leave at once. For the first time in what felt like forever, Redding smiled. A small, tentative thing, but it was a smile nonetheless. The realization that they were free spread through the camp like wildfire. It started as a ripple, a tentative hope, and within moments it turned into a wave of disbelief, and then, finally, a frenzied rush of activity. Redding stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the weight of the officer's words with the reality that surrounded him. Free. The word had once seemed as distant as the stars, but now it was here, in the midst of the cold and suffering. The French soldiers moved quickly, barking orders in rapid French, their expressions grim but decisive. They gestured to the prisoners to gather their belongings, to leave behind what little they had. Some of the men stood motionless, their eyes wide with confusion, unable to comprehend that this moment, this impossible moment, had arrived. Others, however, were already scrambling, their hands shaking as they gathered their few possessions. It was clear that the freedom they had been granted didn't feel real yet. It was as if the men feared it might be another cruel trick, another fleeting hope that would be snatched away before they could grasp it. Redding stood still, watching the chaos around him. His mind felt distant, detached from the physical reality of the moment. He had spent so many months trapped in the brutal monotony of the camp that even the prospect of freedom felt surreal. He had almost forgotten what it meant to live without the constant pressure of survival, to feel the warmth of a full belly, to walk alongside fellow prisoners, to feel the constant pressure of survival. He had almost forgotten what it meant to live without the constant pressure of survival, to feel the comfort of a home around the 16 various ways. One uncomfortable among the thousands had an attractive. But now, as the prisoners hurried to obey the orders, Redding shook himself out of his daze. He had no time to waste on disbelief. The men around him were already moving, gathering their tattered belongings, some calling out to one another, others simply too numb to speak. The guards, though stern, didn't seem as hostile as they once had, almost as though they, too, were caught up in the strange, unsettling energy of the moment. Some of the French soldiers were uncharacteristically silent, their faces unreadable. Redding glanced down at the few things he had, nothing more than his worn-out uniform, a small packet of tobacco, and a half-empty water bottle. There was little to take, nothing of real value. His hands trembled as he stuffed the few items into his coat. He thought of Harper, how he wished his friend could be there to witness this moment, to see the light of freedom flicker in the distance. But Harper was gone, and there would be no one to share this moment with him. The officer who had spoken earlier, tall, with the air of someone accustomed to authority, now turned his attention to the men. His voice cut through the noise as he barked more orders, directing the prisoners to line up. Redding hesitated for a moment before falling into place with the others. His chest tightened with a mix of anticipation and dread. This sudden shift, this unexpected move toward freedom, felt both like a blessing and a curse. It wasn't the way he had imagined escape, and yet it was the only way he knew. As the line of prisoners grew, Redding's mind raced. Where would they go? Would they be escorted to a different camp? Or was this the end of their journey? The questions kept coming, unanswered, but Redding knew better than to focus on the uncertainty. He needed to survive this moment. He had to make it through whatever came next. The French officer walked along the line, inspecting the prisoners with a cold eye, his gaze assessing each man in turn. Redding's heart skipped a beat as the officer stopped in front of him, pausing for a moment before nodding curtly. The officer spoke briefly in French, and though Redding couldn't understand the words, he could tell it was a command of some kind. He nodded in return, barely registering the meaning. The prisoners were then marched out of the camp in tight formation, their movements careful, their eyes darting back and forth. The soldiers flanked them, their rifles ready, their gazes wary, as if expecting some kind of resistance or rebellion. But the prisoners knew better. They had been through too much to risk anything now. They moved forward, step by slow step, through the gates of the camp and into the unknown beyond. Redding felt the cold air on his face as they left the confines of the prison camp behind. It was the first time in months that he had felt truly free, his chest swelling with a sense of liberation. The bitter cold still bit at his skin, and the sounds of the camp, the shuffling of feet, the grating noise of boots on snow, were still echoing in his mind, but they seemed distant now, and faint. There was no going back. As they moved farther away from the camp, the sight of the French soldiers behind them became less and less reassuring. Now that they were free, Redding couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. Were they truly liberated, or were they just being led into a new form of captivity? His thoughts churned with anxiety as he glanced over his shoulder, seeing the dark outline of the camp shrinking into the distance. The march felt endless. The snow-covered ground stretched before them, the path winding through dense forests and barren fields. The cold made it difficult to think, difficult to focus on anything other than the immediate discomfort, but even through the exhaustion and the pain, Redding couldn't help but feel a growing sense of exhilaration. They were no longer prisoners. The world outside the camp was vast, and the prospect of returning to something resembling life, however uncertain that life might be, was a welcome change from the hellish routine they had endured. But with that exhilaration came a weight of uncertainty. What were the French really planning? Were they going to release the prisoners, or were they leading them into another trap? Redding had learned long ago that nothing could be trusted in war, and the kindness of an enemy officer, no matter how promising, was not enough to erase the bitterness of his past experiences. They had been deceived before, and it was hard to shake the feeling that this moment of freedom might slip away as quickly as it had come. The further they marched, the more Redding could see the signs of their fragility. The men, though free, were not unscathed. Many had been weakened by months of deprivation, by illness, by the weight of hunger and fear. They stumbled forward, their movements slow and labored, their faces drawn and hollow. Redding, too, felt the strain, his legs aching and his body fighting against the cold that gnawed at his bones. But there was something more now, something that kept him moving, kept him pushing forward. Hope. It wasn't a loud, triumphant hope, but a quiet, stubborn one. It was the hope of survival, of seeing something beyond this march, of finding a way to keep going despite everything. And for the first time in months, Redding could taste it, a faint sweetness on his tongue. And I thought something had been faulted, because I hope it would not be extinguished, but a life afforded, a call by something. And so the men marched onward, their hearts heavy with uncertainty, but buoyed by the possibility of a new beginning, whatever that might mean. The journey ahead was unknown, but Redding had learned one thing above all else. Survival, no matter the odds, was worth the struggle. The march continued through the desolate winter landscape, and as the hours wore on, Redding began to feel the full weight of the exhaustion that had been creeping up on him. The cold wind bit at his face, and his feet, numbed by the snow, seemed to move on their own. It was a familiar feeling, the dull ache of muscles worn thin by too much strain. But this time there was something different. This time it wasn't simply the crushing weight of captivity, but the heady sense of freedom that drove him forward, step by painful step. The French soldiers led them through a thick stretch of woods, their rifles pointed outward, their faces set in grim determination. Redding could feel their eyes scanning the horizon, as if anticipating some sort of threat. It wasn't unusual for soldiers to remain on high alert, but something about their unease made Redding's gut twist. It was as if they, too, were uncertain about the path ahead. He glanced around at the men flanking him, hollow-eyed, weak, their bodies sagging under the strain, and felt an undeniable surge of empathy. These men had endured the same torment he had, and now they were facing an uncertain future together. He glanced around at the men flanking him and felt an undeniable surge of empathy. They, too, had any number of loved ones limited. Quite suddenly, he thought, a traumatism of unpleasantness. Which left him filled. Though the air was biting, the men tried to keep their minds occupied. Some of them whispered among themselves, exchanging quiet words of encouragement, while others simply trudged along in silence, lost in their own thoughts. Redding found himself falling into step with the soldier beside him. Redding found himself falling into step with a soldier beside him, while others simply tried to keep their minds occupied. Saw that the air was biting. The men tried to keep their minds occupied. Saw that folks were losing confidence in the ideas and withdrawing from life. And though the Phillips hadn't spoken much in the past, but now, as the cold winds howled through the trees, the man seemed to need a connection. "You think they're really letting us go?" Phillips muttered, his breath clouding in the frigid air. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the whole thing disappear. Redding glanced over at him, unsure how to answer. The uncertainty that had plagued him since the officer's announcement still lingered, an ever-present shadow that kept him on edge. The fear of being deceived, of walking into yet another trap, was hard to shake. He had seen too many false promises in his life to believe anything too easily. "I don't know," Redding replied, his voice steady, though the doubt in his chest was hard to suppress. "But we're still here, aren't we? Still walking?" Phillips gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, I guess that's something." They continued on in silence, the sound of boots crunching in the snow the only noise that filled the air. The landscape around them was vast and barren, the woods stretching out into the horizon, a sea of white, broken only by the occasional dark silhouette of a distant tree. There was no sign of civilization in sight, no roads, no houses, just the cold, relentless expanse of winter. Redding felt the bitter chill in his bones, the nagging hunger that had been with him for so long, gnawing at his insides. His stomach growled in protest, but there was nothing he could do about it. The soldiers, French and prisoners alike, continued to march, their faces grim but determined, moving forward through the wilderness without a word of complaint. The only sign of any kind of relief was the occasional halt, when the men were allowed brief moments to rest and catch their breath. But even then, there was no comfort. It was as if the weight of the past months had followed them here, refusing to be shaken off. They marched until dusk, the fading light casting long shadows across the snowy ground. The trees, now appearing as dark sentinels, loomed like silent witnesses to their journey. Despite the ever-present tension, there was a sense of movement in the air, a shift that seemed to push the men forward, further into the unknown. Redding could feel it too, the slow, steady pull of something greater than mere survival. They weren't just walking to escape the camp anymore. They were walking toward something else. The men were looking ahead toward a horizon that was still uncertain, but nonetheless filled with the possibility of a future beyond their ordeal. As night fell, the French soldiers called for a halt. The men huddled together in small groups, exhausted and cold, and tried to find some form of warmth. There were no campfires, no tents to shield them from the elements, just the dark forest around them, and the muffled sounds of breath and movement. The prisoners sat down in the snow, their legs stiff from hours of marching, their bodies aching with fatigue. Redding felt the cold creeping into his bones, but he fought the shivers, unwilling to let it show. He focused instead on the stillness, the quiet that had descended upon them. As he sat, he thought back to the camp, its walls, its routines, the constant threat of death or punishment. The memories felt distant now, as though they belonged to someone else, but even so, the scars of his captivity remained, etched into his mind and body. He could still feel the weight of the shackles, the oppressive air of confinement. Freedom was a heavy thing, yes, but it wasn't without its price. He knew that whatever came next, it would be a struggle, a fight for survival in a world that had become unrecognizable. Phillips, sitting next to him, seemed to share his thoughts. "I don't know about you, Redding, but this doesn't feel like freedom to me. Feels like we're just walking deeper into the unknown." Redding turned to face the man, his expression hardening. "It's all the same, Phillips. We fight, we survive. That's all we've ever done, isn't it?" Phillips nodded, but there was a faraway look in his eyes. "Yeah, I guess. I keep thinking about how different it could be. I mean, we could be walking towards safety, toward a place where there's food, where there's warmth. But I don't know, it's just, I can't shake the feeling that this is one more thing that's too good to be true." Redding considered the man's words. Quieter now. "But we've made it this far. One more step isn't going to kill us." For a long while, neither of them spoke. They sat in the darkness, their eyes drawn to the distant line of trees, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind rustled the branches overhead, and the cold pressed in around them like a shroud. But beneath it all, there was something else, something that kept them moving. The idea that perhaps, after everything they had endured, they might still have a chance. And so, the men slept fitfully, their bodies curled into tight, protective huddles against the biting cold. The French soldiers maintained their vigilance, standing watch, their rifles held close, their faces blank but alert. There was little conversation now, only the low murmur of voices in the distance, the occasional cough or groan of a man too tired to remain silent. Redding lay awake long after the others had closed their eyes, staring up at the dark sky, trying to quiet the thoughts that raced through his mind. What lay ahead? What awaited them in the land beyond this forest? Could it truly be freedom, or was this just another step in a long, unending cycle of suffering? He didn't know. All he could do was keep moving, one step at a time, and hope that somehow it would be enough. The morning light came slowly, creeping over the horizon like the first hesitant steps of a man unsure of his path. The air was thick with frost, the ground beneath Redding's feet a patchwork of snow and ice. He could feel the sharp bite of the cold seeping into his bones as he rose to his feet, the stiff muscles protesting after a night spent hunched against the elements. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead, of the freedom he had fought so hard to win, and whether it would slip through his fingers at the last moment. The men began to stir, shaking off the numbness of the night and gathering what little energy they could muster. Their faces were drawn, pale from hunger, fatigue, and the harsh winds of the previous days. Redding looked around at the faces of his comrades, men who had, just a short time ago, been chained in a hell of their own making, yet now stood on the cusp of something uncertain. There was no joy in their eyes, only the wary awareness that their struggle was far from over. Phillips, who had shared the fire with them the night before, was already up, his expression tired but determined. He didn't speak, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made Redding think they shared the same unspoken understanding. This was not the triumphant march to victory they had once imagined. It was something else entirely, something born of necessity and survival. As the men gathered into their formation, the French soldiers gave curt orders, signaling that the march would continue. The prisoners had no choice but to obey, but even with the soldiers' presence at their backs, the silence between the men felt heavier than it had the day before. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a sense of waiting. For what, no one knew. They moved forward again, walking deeper into the woods. Despite the monotony, Redding couldn't help but feel a faint sense of urgency. There was something in the air, something in the way the soldiers moved and the way the prisoners looked at one another, that suggested that the situation was shifting. His instincts, honed over months of captivity and countless battles, told him that something was about to change. Whether it was for better or for worse, he couldn't yet tell, but he could feel it, deep in his gut. The day passed slowly, each step a reminder of how far they had come, but also how much farther they still had to go. By mid-afternoon, Redding felt his strength beginning to wane. His legs ached with every step, his body too worn from the long journey and the incessant cold to continue at the same pace. But he kept moving. No one could afford to stop, not now. Then, as the group crested a small rise, something shifted. There, in the distance, beyond the thick woods, a faint column of smoke rose into the sky. At first, Redding thought it was just another trick of the wind, a fleeting mirage in the distance, until there was no denying it. It was the unmistakable sign of a fire. It was the most grew thicker, more distinct, until there was no denying it. It was an analysis. It was proof. It was actually a statue. The French soldiers began to murmur amongst themselves, their eyes narrowing as they scanned the horizon. The tension that had been building all day suddenly seemed to burst into the open. Something was wrong. The smoke, the sudden change in the air, it all felt like a warning. Redding's heart pounded in his chest. They had come so far now. Just when it seemed they might be nearing safety, something unknown was ahead. The men fell silent, all eyes on the French soldiers, waiting for some indication of what to do next. The soldiers' leader, the same tall officer who had given the orders the night before, spoke quickly in French, his voice low but urgent. Redding couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a tone of mystery. an attention that was unlike other nights of the year. Then, without any further explanation, Host quickened, as if the air itself had shifted, urging them to hurry. Then, without any further explanation, the soldiers motioned, as if the pace, it was difficult to make out the words, as if their thoughts were too uplifted from the darkness, for they saw the smiles of a few. Redding's senses were on high alert. He could feel it in the air. The tension, the fear. The smoke had changed everything. The French soldiers were moving faster now, their eyes darting around as though expecting an ambush. Redding could see the other prisoners' faces tightening, their weariness now mingled with confusion and fear. What was happening? Who was ahead, and why were they forcing the prisoners to leave? If Redding's senses were on high alert, the same thing was happening with the French soldiers. People not being able to focus on me. Which of us would get the vehicle? As they neared the base of the hill, the smoke became clearer, and, with it, the unmistakable scent of burning wood. There was a camp ahead. Redding's breath caught in his throat. Was it a French outpost? A refugee camp? Or something more dangerous? An ambush? Ah! Then suddenly, the sharp crack of gunfire broke the silence. The sound echoed through the trees, the sharp crack ringing in Redding's ears. It was followed by another, and then another. The soldiers immediately dropped to the ground, rifles raised, their movements quick and precise. The prisoners, caught off guard by the sudden assault, were shoved roughly to the ground by the French soldiers, who shouted orders in French, though none of the prisoners understood. Redding felt a jolt of panic shoot through him. He dropped instinctively to the snow, his heart pounding as his body pressed flat against the ground. The sounds of the gunfire seemed to multiply, the shots piercing the air like a symphony of death. For a moment, Redding forgot everything, the cold, the hunger, the uncertainty, and focused only on the reality of the battle unfolding around him. He strained to see through the snow and trees, trying to make sense of the chaos. The French soldiers were returning fire, but they were outnumbered, their positions compromised by the unexpected attack. Redding's instinct screamed at him to do something, anything. He needed to survive. He couldn't just lie here. He tried to move, to get up, but the weight of the situation held him down. Men screamed, the air filled with the sharp sound of bullets striking trees, the terrifying whoosh of whizzing shots. There was no order now, only confusion and fear. The prisoners, still disoriented by their sudden freedom, were now caught in the same storm as the soldiers. It was clear now, this wasn't an escape, it was a battle. Redding's heart raced. They weren't free, not yet. Whatever had been promised to them was now an illusion, shattered by the violence of the world around them. And as the first few prisoners scrambled to their feet, trying to escape the gunfire, Redding realized something else, that this fight, whatever it was far from over. In the distance, through the smoke and chaos, Redding could just make out the outlines of figures, more soldiers, more attackers, emerging from the trees. He knew then that this was no random skirmish. They had walked straight into the heart of something far more dangerous than any prison camp. The question now was whether they would survive it. The world seemed to stop as Redding lay there in the snow, the echoes of gunfire ringing in his ears, his breath shallow and fast. The fire from the soldiers' rifles cracked through the cold air with brutal clarity, each shot an exclamation of violence that had once existed in his mind. He tried to focus on the immediate, his survival, the men around him, the chaos, but everything felt blurred, as though he were watching the world unfold through a fogged window. The first instinct to run was almost overwhelming, but Redding's military training held him in place. He knew better than to make a reckless move. He had seen enough battles, enough ambushes, to understand that panicked flight often led straight into the heart of danger. So instead, he kept his body pressed to the cold ground, eyes flicking over the scene before him. The French soldiers had quickly formed a defensive line, crouched behind the large, snow-laden trunks of trees. Their rifles fired with precision. Each shot aimed at the shadowy figures that moved quickly in the forest beyond them. From Redding's vantage point, he could just make out the attackers' movements. Men dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by scarves or hoods, advancing through the trees with remarkable speed. They were organized, their tactics swift and efficient. Redding's heart pounded as his mind worked to piece together what was happening. These attackers weren't just random marauders, they were soldiers, or at least well-trained fighters. But who were they? Were they local militia, loyalists, or even a faction of the British Army? The cold logic of war quickly settled in, and Redding knew that the chaos of the moment wasn't the full picture. Something bigger was at play, something that could change the course of everything. The French soldiers seemed to be caught off guard, even though they had been on high alert. The surprise attack was overwhelming their defensive positions, forcing them to fall back further into the trees. Redding saw several of the men fall, one shot in the chest, another collapsing with a scream as a bullet tore through his leg. The snow around them stained red, a stark reminder of the brutal reality of war. "Stay low! Keep moving!" the French officer shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony of gunfire. He gestured frantically, rallying the remaining men to a more strategic position. Redding could hear the panic beginning to rise in the air. The once proud formation of French soldiers had begun to disintegrate. Some of them were retreating, others trying to return fire. But the advantage had already shifted. The attackers were gaining ground, pressing forward with the relentless speed of an advancing storm. Suddenly Redding's thoughts snapped back to his comrades, the prisoners. They were all around him, crouched in the snow, some trying to remain still, while others were scrambling to get to their feet. It was the prisoners' uncertain movements that caught his attention most. They didn't know how to respond. Some of them, still in the haze of exhaustion, were panicking, running blindly through the woods, while others cowered in place, hoping the soldiers' defense would hold. Redding's instincts kicked in. He couldn't afford to let any of them get caught in the open. "Get down!" he barked at the nearest man, pulling him back into the relative cover of the trees. The man, a young soldier barely out of his teens, looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, but obeyed nonetheless. Redding's voice cut through the fear. He wasn't going to lose any of them today. not after everything they'd survived. Turning back to the scene ahead, Redding quickly assessed their options. There was no way they could remain huddled on the ground forever. The attackers were closing in, and the French soldiers were losing their ground. He could hear the sounds of men shouting, the crackle of the gunfire ringing louder with each passing moment. His gaze fixed on the smoke billowing in the distance. It was still rising, thick and dark against the pale sky. The camp, whoever had set it to light, was the likely target of this attack. The French soldiers were caught in the middle of it, their main objective to protect the prisoners and any strategic assets they might be carrying. As the gunfire died down momentarily, Redding spotted a small gap in the attackers' line of fire, a break in the trees where he could see a path leading deeper into the forest. The French were already retreating in that direction, but he knew that the prisoners couldn't stay in the open any longer. They had to move fast, or the attackers would close in completely. "Come on!" Redding shouted again, this time more urgently. He grabbed Phillips by the arm, his voice firm. "We're moving. Now!" Phillips didn't argue, and Redding wasn't about to give him a chance to. The small group of men around them, some of the prisoners, a few wounded but still capable of walking, began to follow, their movements hesitant but determined. As they moved through the trees, Redding couldn't help but glance over his shoulder at the chaos unfolding behind them. The battle was still raging, but now it felt like they were a world away from it. They were moving deeper into the forest, toward the unknown, with only the faintest hope of survival guiding them. The cold wind whipped through the trees, but it felt like a small comfort compared to the stifling fear of the battle. Redding could hear the sounds of gunfire behind them, but they grew quieter as they moved further. The French were trying to regroup, but the attackers were pushing them back, and there was little hope left in the soldiers' eyes. For all the noise, for all the gunfire, it was beginning to feel like a game of survival more than anything else. The path before them grew darker as the trees thickened, and soon the men were walking in near silence, save for the occasional snap of twigs beneath their boots. Redding's senses were razor-sharp as they moved, his eyes darting between the men and the forest. He was acutely aware of every movement, every shadow. The forest, with its seemingly endless stretch of trees, was both a refuge and a trap as they moved in the night, and the forest, with its seemingly endless stretch of trees, separated by narrow ravines that literally flowed across the bottom of the enclosure. They could disappear into it for a time, but it would be just as easy for the attackers to find them again if they weren't careful. They kept moving until the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. There was still no sign of what lay ahead, but Redding had to believe they were headed toward safety. At least, that was what he kept telling himself as they pushed onward. For now, all he could do was keep his head down, keep the men moving, and hope that somewhere in the wilderness there was a way out of this madness. But even as he tried to focus on the immediate, the nagging question remained in the back of his mind. What had they just walked into? And what would it cost them to escape it? The answer, Redding feared, was something they would have to learn the hard way. But there was no turning back now. The soldiers' response. The attackers close in on the French soldiers, and the prisoners must make quick decisions about their survival. They continue their retreat into the woods, away from the battlefield, but the forest itself becomes a trap. Hunger, cold, and confusion plague the men as they navigate unfamiliar terrain, trying to find shelter, or even any signs of friendly forces. Tactical disarray. The French soldiers, outnumbered and overwhelmed, struggle to maintain any order. Their retreat becomes disorganized, with some soldiers deserting and others wounded, further diminishing their strength. The prisoners start to realize that the French forces are in complete disarray, and their survival depends on the cooperation of all involved. Camaraderie and conflict. Tensions rise among the prisoners and soldiers. Some of the prisoners, still traumatized by months of captivity, have trouble trusting their rescuers, while others begin to form bonds of solidarity with the French. The prisoners face moral dilemmas, torn between the fear of continued hardship and the bonds of brotherhood that are slowly being forged. Skirmishes in the wilderness. The group encounters small skirmishes with local militias or hostile forces as they travel deeper into enemy territory with little to no supplies. The men rely on their resourcefulness and limited military training to survive. The men become increasingly resourceful, scavenging what he can and using his knowledge of tactics to help navigate ambushes and dangers. As the group moves through the wilderness, they come to learn that the fort is still under siege. The French are not the only ones fighting to maintain control. Native American forces, allied with the French, are also engaged in the conflict. The men's understanding of the broader battle intensified as they witnessed firsthand the desperation and complexities of war. As the weeks drag on, the physical toll on the prisoners becomes clear. Many are malnourished and sick, with frostbite and wounds. There are emotional breakdowns, fights for leadership, and moments of camaraderie as the man becomes a reluctant leader, forced to make hard decisions about who can continue on the journey and who must be left behind. News arrives that the fort is under siege, and the attackers, British forces, and their Native American allies are closing in on the French defenders. The group of survivors, including both French soldiers and prisoners, join forces with the French reinforcements in a last-ditch effort to hold off the British. The final assault. The men witness the brutality of battle as the fort is assaulted. The cannon fire, smoke, and screams of the dying fill the air. Some of the soldiers, including the men, must now fight for their very lives, knowing that survival may not be possible. The French forces are pushed to the brink, and the prisoners face an internal battle over whether to remain loyal to their commanders or risk everything to escape and survive. A moment of reflection. Amid the chaos of battle, the men reflect on everything that has led up to this moment. His capture, his journey, the people he has lost, and the uncertainty of the future. These moments of introspection give depth to his character and reinforce the themes of survival, sacrifice, and brotherhood. The French forces are ultimately forced to surrender Fort William Henry, and the prisoners are caught in the fallout. The other men are marched out under the watchful eyes of British forces and their Native American allies who demand their surrender. The emotional weight of the surrender is palpable as the men struggled with the loss of hope, realizing that escape and freedom may now be even farther away than before. The men are now taken as prisoners once again, but they are treated differently this time. Some British officers take pity on the survivors, seeing the toll the siege has taken on them. Others view them as nothing more than casualties of war. The men must reconcile with the idea of being a prisoner once again, facing not only the physical challenges, but also the mental strain of knowing how close they were to freedom. At the end, the war is far from over, but they have come to understand that survival, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, is its own form of victory. Their life may never be the same, but in that quiet moment, there is a sense of closure, a sense that they have fought not only for survival, but for something larger, an understanding of what it means to endure, to survive, and to keep moving forward, no matter the cost.